And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, undercover angel, midnight fantasy. I never had a dream that makes me love me. And Judith Campbell Exner certainly fills the bill on this. Her whole story, which was puzzled over by Kennedy historians and enemies and everything in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they missed something very, very, very important in her testimony that could shake this entire declass effort of the Declassification Committee run by Representative Luna and Tim Burchett. Yes, he wants it pronounced Burchett, and not people have tried to correct me and say it's Burchett. No, he says it's Burchett, and I've been pronouncing it Burchett. And there's a couple of interesting things there because I have to say that so much of this story is an FBI story. And so the CIA is involved, but the FBI records on Judith Baker would be particularly eye-opening. And if they could be added to this declassification effort, it may open up a huge aspect of not the assassination, but the UFO file. That's the interesting thing here, and I'm going to put that connection in tonight, which is all of the things that they've put out there in terms of information for trying to get people to reflect back on the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. Their backup plan has always been to blame it on the mob at the end of the day and get themselves out of the whole thing by saying, well, we couldn't say lone nut because it would have been a war with Russia, so what we did instead was we called it a lone nut. We couldn't say it was, that, but actually what was going on in the background was it was the mafia, and we knew it. Now, there have been things floated out there about the mob for years in relation to Kennedy's murder, and the assassination is very important to see in the context of the fact that the mob didn't have the ability to do things like doctor autopsies, all sorts of things, put the media to sleep and everything else. So no, the mafia was not the instrument behind it. However, all the research around the mafia is going to lead us into the aerospace elements deep, deep in the deep state that performed this action and how it's related to the UFO file. We're going to get into all that tonight through the figure of Judith Exner. And Exner is a remarkable woman who went through a remarkable experience dealing not only with spooks, CIA spooks, the FBI, and mafia kingpin Sam Giancana, but also the president of the United States acting as his courier for some very, very interesting cargo along the way. And that's tonight's episode. It's X Series episode 192, Exner JFK Assassination UFO File Mystery. And I want to remind you that we will be taking your questions in the second part of tonight's episode. And you can ask those questions anytime. Put them in caps for Miss Olivia. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Rotten Cryptobits wants to know, did mob girl Judith Exner have a handler?
Well, it was hard. See, the thing, it's very interesting as I get into the story. You could say that Frank Sinatra was her handler, was her enabler. And there's a lot of mind control in tonight's story, including of Frank Sinatra, which is an interesting thing because Sinatra himself and his rather unusual childhood of being beaten so regularly and growing up among this mafia contingent with his mother hosting them in her musical tavern there and also supplying some very interesting things. You know, if you read those bios of Sinatra, it's quite fascinating because what you're going to discover is that a lot of his criminal disposition comes from the environment he grew up in, but also the people that they talked to get information on him and about his childhood, they would talk about the types of beatings that Sinatra would get. And so this is no ordinary kind of like subtle abuse situation. He was really beaten up. So Sinatra, the minute he lands in the middle of this element of organized crime, they're like a saving grace for him. And that violent environment is deep in his own subconscious. So, but he does become very interestingly, sort of the CEO of the mafia. He's the public face of the corporation of the mafia for many years. And of course, his activities in Las Vegas eventually will lead to many of the grand casinos and all the rest of it. So there's an entire thing happening there out of Las Vegas in this period. And Sinatra gets into it early. Sinatra becomes important for a couple of reasons in this story, as he is the liaison between Judy Exner and President Kennedy, but he's also the one who facilitates her meeting with Sam Giancana. And if this were an episode that was going to be about JFK and the Mafia, it would be interesting, but it's actually about JFK and aerospace. But the Mafia elements help us to surface that story, and that's why tonight is going to go really deep. What do you got in there?
Well, on a side note, Mark West wants to know, please ask DJ why the delay on releasing the JFK, RFK, and MLK files. David Tormina responds, the files are scheduled to be released on the 26th of March, hopefully.
Yeah, there's an apparatus in place. There are problems, though, and there are a lot of blocking activities going on deep in CIA headquarters. And the thing is, a lot of people just looking at this and pundits taking a shot at it have said, well, what's the holdup if you've got Kash Patel at FBI and Radcliffe at CIA and all the rest, and Pam Bondi? But they have, as I mentioned, a Stansfield Turner problem. Stansfield Turner is the CIA director during the Carter era. And what happens is Carter inherited George H.W. Bush from Ford. And Carter said, look, I did a campaign promise about the UFO file, and I want everything that you have, and I want to review it to see what I can declassify and put out there. And Bush said to him, well, you don't really have a need to know as president in relation to the UFO file, so I have to turn down the request. And so Carter fires Bush for this reason very early on. And often in that period, if you were even a Republican and, you kept an entire cabinet of Democrats, or if you're a Democrat, you'd keep a lot of the people, like the FBI director would come over with you, the CIA director would come over with you. Now, that still happens a little bit, but they kind of throw everybody out and replace them. But in that period, it was a little bit unusual to just get rid of Bush like that. But he had damn good reason in this case. So Carter wasn't putting up with that. But what's interesting is Carter installs his friend, Stansfield Turner, who, comes out of a military academy and stuff and is going to report. And he's like, I thought I'd get a real idea of what was going on with CIA there. But he was iced out. And the real players, they had the ability to go offshore. And in that case, they created something called the Safari Club. And they would hook up with all the different intelligence agencies around the world and just hang out and wait for Carter's presidency to be over. By the time the Reagan thing came in, they were all back and, business as usual. So this is very interesting as well, because these guys, Patel and all the rest of it, they have a Stansfield Turner problem, because Stansfield Turner is kind of the emblem of somebody who's on the outside trying to get in, even though he's technically the director. These people in the CIA had decades and decades of planning for, when somebody hostile to their covert plans got into power. So they know how to do this whole system. And it's very interesting. If you track some of them, it's quite unusual because, of course, Nixon got rid of Dick Helms. And Dick Helms was really a deep player as a Dulles lieutenant and deeply involved in the JFK assassination. And it's very interesting because some tapes have come out in the last year and a half that show Nixon going back and forth with Helms and recording him and saying, look, I know you were involved. I know the agency was involved around all this, and I want to protect the agency. And so those questions are going to come up about the who shot John Kennedy angle. I want you to do me a favor. Give me everything you have in relation to this, and I'll be able to protect you guys from all the dirty tricks that you've done, and I'll be happy to do it for the country's sake and all the rest. So now that tape's been released. Now, here's the interesting thing about the Watergate tapes. Only 30%, a third of those tapes, are even seeing the light of day. And the other aspect of the Watergate tapes, still, remember, Watergate took place in 1972, and Nixon left office in 1974. So the fact that we don't have those tapes is remarkable, but that's a battle between the family on one hand and the government on the other. Now, here are the other tapes that you don't get to hear, the ones the government gets from the family, but they don't want out. So there's a third block there. So there's tons and tons of stealth archives whenever we get around deep events in our history, the JFK assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11. And this is going to be an ongoing thing. So I think there's, this idea of transparency in the Trump administration. They're going to do it. They are making big strides and big efforts towards releasing this stuff. And it's very interesting because a guy I respect a lot, Jefferson Morley, recently showed up in one of my X threads and said, they're getting very bad marks for the Trump administration, that is, for not releasing these things. But it's very early. The Trump administration, what you generally do with a new administration is you judge them 100 days out. So the people who were jumping left and right this early on, you kind of have to get back into power. And then it takes 100 days and they kind of redo and go over the 100 days. That's how you get your scorecard and what the presidency is up to. But Trump's emphasis, I think, around the executive orders coming in, shaking things up immediately was smart because things were so entrenched and the public was so screwed over the 4-year period of Biden's presidency that Trump instantly had to go in with a lot to undo. And so I think they've done a good deal of that. The problem is with the JFK files, the Central Intelligence Agency has such a block there. So you're going to have an upheaval in the agency. And you do have a new director and you do have a new DNI, which is Tulsi Gabbard. But, their positions are tenuous in this sense, which is they're technically those leaders of the CIA, the agents are accountable to them, but they have systems for getting around that. And one of those systems is very interesting. It was the people who were getting into power during the nomination process. And a very unusual story came up this week. It was all about Tucker Carlson talking about how he knew that there was somebody who the Trump administration was planning for deputy CIA director, and that there was somebody blocking that, saying, no, that person will release the JFK files. No way can we let them get in. And that person was on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So he got asked who it was, and he identified Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas as the person who was trying to block this particular individual who he did not name, but who I later learned was Amaryllis Fox, who was the campaign manager for RFK Jr., and a former CIA agent herself, who's now on an advisory board for President Trump on intelligence. So Tucker, this is a blockbuster that heated this week up, claims JFK files are being desperately blocked by senior politician. Now, he put a lot on the line to put this out there and the name and everything else. Immediately, Cotton, who's an unusual character, in my opinion, and a lot of his connections are very, very dubious indeed. But GOP Senator knocks false Tucker Carlson allegation he's fighting against JFK assassination files release. This is the tug of war going on. That is the battle that still continues in the middle of all this, which is there's this tussle over these records that are 61 years old at this point. But here's the thing. The fundamentals of the JFK assassination, the ramifications of the system that grew up out of that assassination are still here with us. And that battle inside the government we've seen take place, everything from the prosecution of Trump under the Biden administration to the FBI targeting of citizens. All these things continue to go on. And what you get are cleanup efforts that happen once in a while. In the 70s, you had the Church Committee, things like that. In the 90s, the Assassination Record Review Board and all the rest of it. And very often, they were followed up by a series of unknown, very mysterious deaths under unknown circumstances for many people. So what you're looking at is a process of one function of the government trying to get the truth out and being blocked and being maneuvered around. But there comes a point where the public's taste for the truth becomes so hardcore that the government is at a standstill. They generally in some of those back rooms somewhere, they're sitting around saying, well, we have to give them something. So you've got Trump transparency, but then it's going to hit a wall because inside you have layers and layers of that deep state cake. Now, Tom Cotton is an interesting figure in all this, being Republican. Do you see how this works? Because the Democrats have acted so crazy in the last few years that, it's easy to forget that there are many, many Republicans that are deep staters as well. So it's not really a right-left conversation. It's more of a people who want good government versus people who are attached to that establishment that is benefiting so much by keeping these things secret. So what we've got with the JFK files is very crucial, and they need to show something. The Pam Bondys and Tulsi Gabbards and all the rest of it, they realize that. John Ratcliffe over at CIA has the most important job. We might make their job a little bit easier, especially if they're tuning in tonight, because there's some things here which might be files they can get their hands on directly, which is the FBI surveillance for 6 years of Judith Exner. And we're going to get into that tonight. And we're going to hear from some last excerpts just before she died, a few audio excerpts that I got of Judith Exner telling us exactly what was at risk when she was acting as a courier between the President of the United States and Sam Giancana, Mooney Momo, who was the man himself, deep entrenched in that deep state and at the behest of the CIA doing their bidding. A few other things I want to mention about the JFK records as well, which is, they have websites and things set up for some of those records that can come out. Now what I'm hearing is, so there's a delicate dance going on in relation to Russia and Ukraine because of all the negotiations that are going on between Putin and Trump. And, those negotiations are at a very interesting stage, in fact. And I think that the Trump administration is handling it and giving it a real heavy emphasis, which wasn't there at all in the Biden administration. They were pushing it, and pushing it and bringing us to the brink of World War III. So I do feel like there's a very responsible attitude going on in relation to this, and that the Trump forces understand that it's a money boondoggle that's going on there in relation to Ukraine and the Russian war. So it's a boondoggle for the defense contractors, and it doesn't really benefit America in any way. So this is something, where they're looking at it, and Trump realizes one of the goals is to end that war immediately. And one of the things he implored Putin to do, since there were a number of soldiers that were encircled that were Ukrainian soldiers, was basically to spare them, And this is where those things are going back and forth right now. But I feel like something is happening where, they're saying, well, in the background, don't give our enemies the ability to say the United States, like the CIA is, the type of group that just would overthrow elections and do assassinations, and that they killed President Kennedy. You have to find some way to present this. And this is the nature of the problem. Of course, the records don't say, hey, we're the CIA and we did it. But the records are going to point to enough factors that are going to show that the story, the official version that they gave out about Oswald and the old gun and the Texas School Book Depository, was completely a joke. And so therefore, they need some way to be able to spin this, especially because Trump threw down the gauntlet and said, I'm letting the records out, and made it an executive order. So I think that's going to bear a lot of good results. The problem is that the committees and things that they're talking about, I think the way that they should do this is release the records, then have the committees and call in witnesses in relation to the various obstructions that took place. And you could get some surprise witnesses. I think for example, around the Joanides records in particular, and Joanides, of course, was our top psychological warfare guy for the CIA, who nobody knew anything about. And, he was discovered through the efforts of Jefferson Morley. And his work is so important for what took place there, because Joanides is like this phantom character who was responsible for the psychological operation of the Oswald Project. And so those records are crucial, and the CIA has fought to keep those back. But there is that famous picture, which we've shown on this program many times, of him being given the Career Achievement Award. It was a major, major deal in CIA headquarters by Bobby Inman. And so I think through the mechanism of trying to get at the George Joanides records, that you can call in Bobby Inman under subpoena and ask him, why was the CIA giving him this Career Intelligence Medal? Was it because of his work in obfuscating the JFK assassination and the intelligence role in it? And while you're at it, since you are, a former deputy CIA director, you went on the records in 1989 and 1991 with a writer named Timothy Good and said, not only do we know what the UFOs are, but we know who's flying them. So I think you could open up the JFK UFO file conversation, which is what we're going to do here tonight. But that committee can get, by looking at things through the lens of Aerospace, can get a lot deeper than, for example, looking at the mafia or a state actor, like Russia or Cuba and all the stupid things that they've peddled out there for years, which don't make any sense, because no state actor would ever take the chance of trying to eliminate the foreign leader of America. In this case, at that point in time, there's no state actor that holds up in relation to that. So let's keep that in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going to go deep tonight through the figure of Judith Campbell Exner, an actress who in some ways had a background not too dissimilar in the way she was coming up in the ranks as another actress involved in this story, Marilyn Monroe. But before she got to fame and fortune, she had this left turn and became the wife of a famous actor, and William Campbell. And Campbell was known for Westerns and things of that nature, and was a very young, hard to deal with alcoholic husband. So it's very interesting that she sort of curtailed her own acting career, got involved in this marriage that lasted, I think, 4 years, and then was divorced and in her early 20s. So an unusual thing for a good Catholic girl. And she came from money, and it's very interesting because her dad, in fact, was a rich architect, and they were right there outside of Los Angeles, and she got into these circles of Hollywood and married Campbell. And then she had other, kind of high-level romances like Robert Wagner and people like that in the 50s. So she was coming out of that milieu, and she had a short relationship with Frank Sinatra, and that got her into a number of different types of contacts. So she really comes out there as kind of innocent in a sense, and there's, hauled into this Hollywood scene. And what happens is someone somewhere deep in the system decides this is a good person for us to use. And she becomes such an insider on the mafia side with Sinatra, with Sam Giancana, and then ultimately with President Kennedy. And then the FBI gets the ability to use her as a dangle, and something of a real kind of sort of Damocles over the Kennedy administration during his presidency. And in fact, at a certain point, J. Edgar Hoover ends up going to the White House and saying, hey, by the way, this girlfriend that you have, she also is the girlfriend of Sam Giancana, and we know all about it. And, a little wink and nod, like, don't worry about it. We'll keep your secret, But it was kind of a menacing situation. I often think the relationship of Hoover and the Kennedys is not always well understood, because there's a factor there where they despise each other for sure, but Kennedy had the ability to fire Hoover, but he intentionally left him in, and that was on the advice of his own father. But it was a menacing relationship throughout, and Kennedy would refer to Hoover as dangerous as a rattlesnake. And when the author William Manchester recorded these interviews with Robert Kennedy, upon hearing that description, was like, oh, that's an understatement. Yeah, absolutely. And Robert Kennedy talked about how they tried to have this, they made a fuss over him, and they did all these things to try to make it feel like they had a good relationship back and forth. But President Kennedy immediately did something, which is Hoover used to have direct access to the presidents as the FBI director, but technically the head of the DOJ, the Attorney General, is the boss of the FBI director, even though Hoover was this, legend all the way from the 1920s. And so we get into a situation where as soon as Kennedy gets in, he says, yeah, I'm going to keep J. Edgar as FBI director, but he doesn't deal with me directly. He deals with Bobby. That instantly became a problem. And it becomes quite fascinating the way that relationship develops. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Palmer Pamela says, I met William Campbell on a Star Trek cruise in 1995. I want more details.
Excellent.
And David Tormita says, DJ, in an interview a few years old, Inman tried to make the case that the Exner story points to the mafia behind Ruby killing Oswald to hide their involvement in Operation Mongoose.
Interesting. You said Inman makes the case?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. Email that to me at admin@darkjournalist.com if you would. David, I'd be very, very appreciative of that. There's no question that Inman was a deep, deep insider. And, he was a close family friend of John Warner. And so when we had John Warner IV on here, he could talk all about Inman, staying over with his dad, John Warner, the head of the Navy. And the association, the deep association of, Inman is also NSA director. His work in the UFO file runs very, very deep. And he seemed like an advocate for transparency there in the early 90s around this. So something, happened further out where the spin that he was going to give it is something the establishment decided not to go with. And in any case, I don't think we were going to get the truth out of him there. But Inman is a very interesting character and holds those secrets. He's still alive. He's still active. He's 93 years old. And one of the conferences that we did for the Secret Space Program, he was present. So he's still plugged into that. He lives in Austin. And, I think you could take him on, even if, as a non-hostile witness, and just say, put him under oath. In particular, in relation to he would know why they were giving the Career Intelligence Medal to Joanides. That's what the Central Intelligence Agency doesn't want to give up. And it's very clear that the role that Joanides played was off the charts, because not only was he the person who created the Oswald Project, he was subsequently the key man in all of the reinvestigations of the Kennedy assassination after the Warren Commission. So the Church Committee, the House Assassinations Committee, and all that, they would put him out there, Joanides. So he was the one who knew, don't touch this, don't go into that. But on the side of the investigators, they thought, hey, we're getting this great guy, But that's interesting. I would very much like to hear Inman's spin on that. And there's a lot of wild cards in tonight's episode, including the fact that as part of her courier job, many people, including best-selling authors, in this case, the best-selling author who did The Dark Side of Camelot, which is a total hit job on JFK, but all of his sources were CIA people that he used to expose. So that's Seymour Hersh. And Hirsch, there's no question that he's done some good work in the past, absolutely. But Dark Side of Camelot is just a total hit job. But he's trying to pick up on this story that's hot at that period of time because Judith Exner has come out and told more of her story because she had a fatal illness and decided, I'm not going to hold back on this anymore. And, for the record, here's what really happened. And so she admitted to the fact that she was a courier between President Kennedy and Sam Giancana. And what she was doing, she said, was passing these envelopes that were about, it seemed like whatever was in them was about the size of a magazine. And she did multiple trips, about 24 of these trips with information. And at certain points, some of those envelopes, Giancana would have to take the information, look at it, put it back in the envelope, give it to her, and she would have to go back and give it to Kennedy. Now, in terms of, what Seymour Hersh was trying to say, he said, I'm sure what was going on is there were payoffs back and forth. Well, one of the times that Judy Exner was coming back, I keep saying Judy Baker, that's our friend from Lee Harvey Oswald story. Judith Exner decides at a certain point, I'm going to look, just to see what this is. And what she looks at and what she finds is not, $1,000 bills, things of this nature, big payoffs. What she finds is a weird blueprint for an aerospace craft. And the question becomes, why is Sam Giancana sending President Kennedy through Judith Exner blueprints for aerospace craft? This becomes the question. I think we can answer this with some clarity tonight. It gets very interesting when you start to look at it from that angle. Here's another interesting angle.
Wait, can I get you to correct something for a second?
Yes.
Is this JFK sending it to Giancana or back? Giancana
they go back
Kennedy?
and forth. So he sends, he's sending these magazine-style envelopes to Giancana, but Giancana is sending back his own envelopes. At one point, there's certain envelopes that he has to read and then send back, but then he gets an envelope, he gives an envelope. And so when she's going back with one of the envelopes for Kennedy from Giancana, she opens it up and she sees the blueprints. So Giancana is sending Kennedy blueprints. Question is why? Now, there's a few interesting side notes here as well. A lot of the people, there was a real big thing to try to spin everything to the mafia. And this has happened a few times, but really, if you read those books, all they have for evidence is, Carlos Marcello said on a wiretap, wow, I banged that Kennedy, I got him out of the way. All this kind of stuff, which is just mafia talk, and you'd want to take credit as a mafioso for that. It's the people who don't talk that, were performing the action. Now, what's interesting is around Judith Exner's story, so many people on the research side said, this is all related to the fact that the Kennedys wanted to assassinate Fidel Castro. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. One, the Kennedys, when they found out the CIA was attempting to assassinate Castro, tried to put a stop to it and were horrified. That's on the record. So very often what the Central Intelligence Agency will do is they will, as was uncovered during Howard Hunt's testimony in Watergate, they'll forge memos to create a past for people. So if a researcher goes back, they can go, aha, I found this document, and it says, Kennedy wanted to assassinate the leader of Vietnam, which is the cable that Howard Hunt created. It was total phony. And he was under oath, and he said, no, I created that cable, and Kennedy had nothing to do with it. So there were a series of things going on in 62 and 63. They really ramped up in 63. But during Kennedy's presidency, there were all these assassinations of foreign leaders or attempted assassinations, and they were all done by the Central Intelligence Agency. So this was the CIA out of control and Kennedy trying to rein it back in. Now, 3 weeks before President Kennedy is assassinated in America, the Diem brothers are assassinated in Vietnam. Now, President Kennedy's standing orders, was not to let that happen. So therefore, the Central Intelligence Agency went out of their own way, and it was a tense political situation in Vietnam, but they facilitated, the shooting of the Diem brothers. So before that, in the Congo, you had Lumumba. During Kennedy's presidency, of course, the CIA tried to oust General de Gaulle as the leader of France. And they had a whole thing set up where another general was going to take his place. And, the thing got foiled, but it was that close. And then de Gaulle said to Kennedy directly, what's going on? I have French intelligence reports that the CIA was involved in this. What are you trying to do? And Kennedy said, there's a factor inside of the intelligence community we're not responsible for, and I'm trying to get control of it. All of that's on the record. So Kennedy is battling this thing. And so the intelligence community, what they have in order to create the great changes, they have to knock people off all at once. So they have what I've referred to as seasons of assassination. And they try to create a season of assassination here this past summer with the assassination attempts on President Trump. And that didn't go so well. Now, it's very interesting. You can see these waves as they happened. As I mentioned, the UN director, of course, in 1961, he got assassinated. They took his plane down, and Lumumba, as I mentioned. But there are a series of these assassinations also that took place in Central America just before Kennedy got in. So they were ramping up into this program. By the time they eliminate Kennedy, he's kind of the cherry on top for the whole thing. And so the assassination factor and how that changes the power structure in governments is not, it's not studied correctly, in my opinion. You have to understand how assassinations work and how they impact all the different functions of government. And so therefore, the Central Intelligence Agency, their main forte, aside from disinformation, is assassination. So whenever there is an assassination of a high-level figure, the first place you should go to is the Central Intelligence Agency. It may be them, it may not be them, but they're high on the suspect list because of this history. And they've never disavowed this history. And in fact, when you get a lot of these CIA people, as I've got around the UFO file, people like Jim Semivan or whatever, whenever they get questioned about the dark history of the CIA, they said, oh, well, that was a few people back in the 1970s, but everything's great now. No, not so much. The Central Intelligence Agency set up, of course, just in the past few years to assassinate Julian Assange, private citizen, last time I checked. And, that's on record. Their programs haven't changed very much at all. In fact, the lack of reform of that agency is the thing that's astonishing. So when we get into this, let's remember that hovering around these stories about the mafia and things like that is the imprint, the figure of the Central Intelligence Agency, that looming shadow hanging out there in the back. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 192. It's the Exner JFK Assassination UFO file mystery revealed. We're going to really open up a conversation here that's been waiting to happen. And it'll give the keys for this declass committee, if they have the nerve, if they have the guts to do this. This might be the very key that they need. We're also going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. I want to remind everyone out there, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch with all of you, with all the incredible things we have coming up for you. Documentaries, incredible X-Series episodes, interviews that'll blow your mind. We have them coming up. We're setting them up for April. And the new documentary, of course, we're doing some new documentary series episodes, the docuseries of Hacking Atlantis that we're doing, and also in relation to John F. Kennedy and the UFO file. That one we are in the middle of shooting. So all that is coming out. It's all there in your newsletter, and it gets you around some of the social media blocking that we see going on, the censorship of the work that we do. It's all there. So go to darkjournalist.com and make sure you stand up and be counted, and make sure you're on that newsletter list. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
This is interesting. Nance Hardwick says, my dad was one of the agents who surveilled Marcello and said he was too dumb to carry out an assassination plot. This was later in the 80s. Happy Hermit 3D says, are these envelopes unsealed that Exner can open and read the contents?
No, she didn't. Here's the thing. I want to make this very clear, which is she kept her role very well through all of these different transactions. But at a certain point, because she was under such heavy FBI surveillance and everything else, she wanted to know, she had that thing of what is going on here that I'm getting, tailed by so many of these agents. And so this is a rare occasion that she was able to do this. So she found a way to figure out what was in there, and it was a blueprint. Now, I'm going to read a few things that she had to say about that because it's a perfect lead-in. I want to say that I think that through the years, she withheld certain details for her own survival, but it was brave all the way through. She didn't want to come forward. She was identified by 2 staffers and a lawyer who were connected. I've got the actual name of the committee here, but it was in 1975. It was all about the CIA activities into foreign leader assassinations. This was their focus. And when they were going through it, they found all of the different phone calls that Judith Exner had made to Jack Kennedy. And then when they did a little research on her, they found that the FBI was surveilling her in relation to Shinkana. So they were the ones who put it together. And they said to her, we want you to come forward in session and testify. And she said, I can only do that if you guarantee my privacy. And they said, don't worry about it. She shows up, she goes, she gives the testimony, her name leaks immediately. And many of the Kennedy faithful, like Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's secretary and all the rest, don't want the kind of, this is early in the Kennedy wave of stuff. Later they'd have full documentaries about President Kennedy's misdeeds and, his different paramours and things. But at this point, 1975, that wasn't really the big part. She's kind of one of the first big scandals on that front. And so on one side, you have, the FBI trying to discredit her, and you have the mafia probably making plans to see, oh, she was Sam Giancana's girlfriend. We just killed Giancana, so they were probably putting her on the radar. And so she's surrounded by a very hostile environment. So we have to remember, and I will go back a little bit into her history, but with Exner, that she was an aspiring actress and that she fell into this very early. And the idea of, having a romance with the president of the United States, who is having you act as a courier to a high-level mafia figure, in my opinion, what he was doing was, there's all these research people who say that the Kennedys were trying to kill Castro. I just debunked that. Now, it was the Central Intelligence Agency that were trying to hire mafia people to kill Castro. And all of that stuff was going on. But I think the information that Kennedy was getting from Giancana was of a nature where he was saying, tell me what the CIA is telling you about how they think they're going to use you and what the team structure is to go in there and assassinate Castro. He wanted to do it to be able to keep tabs on what they were doing in a clandestine fashion, as opposed to be, joining in with the CIA on the Castro kill plots with the mafia. No way. Kennedy was not, the reason he had such difficulty with the Central Intelligence Agency is because he did not go along with things along this line. And so this is the reason for the government divided against itself. And they just thought, especially Dulles, when he was there, he thought, I basically created the Central Intelligence Agency. Who is this guy coming in, this rich playboy. We've just designed the world for the past 3 decades, and we are beating back the communists. We collaborated with the Nazis and all the rest. And so he's thinking that this guy is upsetting the entire apple cart, and there's no reason to stop doing what they're doing, and that the president really doesn't have the ability to do that. Of course, this is somebody who, when he was in his house in Switzerland, claimed that whatever he did there was outside of the realm of the United States because he was in a different country. I mean, Dulles would use any excuse. The thing is, he and his brother set up the world the way the way it arrived by 1960. They were deeply, deeply involved with every major aspect, everything from oil companies to armaments and all the rest of it, drug running, sex slavery. I mean, these guys were deep, deep into that whole thing. So when Kennedy comes along and he's giving them specific instructions, you can't do this, and you can't assassinate foreign leaders. He's giving them directives, and they're like, oh, it's nice to hear that. We're doing our program anyway. That was the nature of the struggle over the 3 years that President Kennedy was there. So the idea that some researchers get when they trip into the mafia thing in relation to Kennedy is they get the wrong idea that he's collaborating with the CIA to kill Castro. The record does not hold up on that at all. As a matter of fact, what the record sustains is that they were freaked out when they learned about these plots. That makes a heck of a lot more sense. And there's reason to think that, of course, a large aspect of the establishment and the government was trying to remove Castro. And yet there's something weird there, too. And I'll tell you, I've explored this in an episode that I think was the best episode from 2024, but it came out just around the time of the Trump assassination thing, so it got glossed over a little bit. That episode is called Wise Guys in the Hot Zone. And I've pointed this out before, but there's an aspect there going on about Cuba and allowing Castro to rise. Because, of course, they had all this, the mafia and the government had all of this stuff behind Batista. But once Castro is making waves and they're thinking, oh, maybe the government won't support Batista, they allow, under Eisenhower, Castro to get into power in 1959. So it's allowed, and then there's this backlash as if they need to get him out in a hurry. But somewhere a certain program or something went wrong there, because it looks to me like Castro was being installed because they had every ability, when he had only 500 fighters or whatever, to get rid of him. But instead they placed people close to him, like Frank Fiorini and others, Frank Sturgis, and sort of monitored him and almost seemed to help him get into that position. So therefore, part of the, getting rid of Castro and, oh, the CIA had 600 plots, they just couldn't get to that Castro, doesn't add up for me. What I think happened was he was going to be their tool, and then he changed on that, and that when his association with the Soviets gave him the ability to have the heavy security against a CIA assassination. So when those attempts came in, it hit a wall. But certainly they allowed him to get into that position. So back to Judith Exner. So Exner is identified by these two lawyers and a staffer for this Foreign Assassination Committee in 1975 because of all these calls and visits that she made to the White House, and the fact that they crisscrossed her with the FBI surveillance on Giancana and found out, oh, wait a minute, she's also going out with Giancana. Let's figure out what this woman is all about. They put her under oath, and then she has a press conference after that where she has to be very tight-lipped, but the media already knows, so many things have leaked, that this looks like a very tough position for her to be in. And remember, this woman, Judith Campbell Exner, has already been put in a tremendously high pressurized situation of FBI surveillance, of doing things for the president, of dealing with mafia chieftains. So she's in an incredibly tough spot. Now, what she does is she puts out a limited hangout of a book in the late 70s. And she talks about how she wasn't, sending things back and forth with Kennedy and Giancana, but that this is how she knew Giancana, this is how she knew Kennedy, and that she had all these visits to the White House with Kennedy and all the rest. And the Kennedy people try to discredit her, but they can't because she has all the records and she saved all the records. So very interestingly, if we go and we look at how she came into this position, it is Frank Sinatra who back there in 1960 introduces her to Kennedy. A lot of people have thought that Sinatra was instructed by the mafia to put her there to get information about what Kennedy was going to do when he got in office, because his father, Joseph Kennedy, was going around to all these different factions, unions, all these things that are mafia related, and saying, we need to get Jack in 1960. And they're checking him out on their own. So part of this activity is for Sinatra to get close with Kennedy and then introduce the girlfriend, Judith Exner, and use her as a conduit, as a way to kind of have surveillance on Kennedy. And then what ends up happening is this woman becomes the intermediary for Kennedy dealing with Giancana. And it's very interesting because she meets Giancana and she thinks that his name is Sam Flood, because Sinatra and his group refers to Giancana as Sam Flood. And she just thinks that he's this flashy guy hanging out in Hollywood. Little by little, it dawns on her what's going on. And then at a certain point, Kennedy asks her to set up meetings. Now, Kennedy's become her lover at this point, and he's asked her to set up a series of meetings with Giancana. And so she's the intermediary there. I want to mention this. I said this about Frank Sinatra before. When Sinatra was young, he grew up in this milieu of gangsters, and that all came through his mother's tavern and all the rest of it, where he would perform even when he was 9 years old and stuff. But I think because he was beaten, he was particularly open to these and attracted to this very violent environment of the mafia when he was, coming up. And one of the mafia people that he got connected with was Bugsy Siegel, and he starts bragging about his friend Bugsy Siegel, and then Siegel gets gunned down. So he's had to switch on and off quite a bit through his career, but there was no doubt that in the 40s and the 50s, he became very deeply entrenched with the mafia, and that a lot of his career aspect, that great talent, was in service to this larger machine. Also, the fact that, the Hollywood influence of the mob, when we're looking at this, they had an incredible influence because the Chicago Mafia ran the unions that did all the production. And if they didn't like something that was going on, or if they said, this is the girl you have to use in your movie or whatever, these directors and producers and people had to play ball, or else the mafia could boycott them or whatever it happened to be. And supposedly this is how Sinatra, when his career was on the wane, got into Hollywood. And, he turned into such a good actor, it didn't matter anyway. But he got the role From Here to Eternity and things like that when nobody really wanted him. So there's a lot of control and a lot of backdoor stuff in there when we're getting around people like Frank Sinatra. So I want to introduce an unusual aspect here, which is in 1962, he starts to work on a movie called The Manchurian Candidate. And this is based on a novel by Richard Condon. And Condon is also the person who will write a novel in the 70s called Winter Kills, which is all about the assassination of President Kennedy. Very, very unusual. But what's interesting about The Manchurian Candidate is it works openly with the idea of mind control very early on. And it's got presidential assassination. Now, there's another movie that Sinatra did called Suddenly in 1954, which is all about him being an assassin waiting for the president to come in on a train so he can assassinate him from this house. And so there's a lot of this presidential assassination vibe around Sinatra. Now, in the movie, of course, the Queen of Diamonds is the function of how the assassin gets put into his trance. And over again, it's come up. This motif has been used in other things, like Twin Peaks used it, for example. But this thing about the Queen of Diamonds is very interesting, and I believe it goes into an early mystery school interpretation, and this is where I think the intelligence agencies were getting this, that if you look into something like the Gurdjieff work or Steiner's work, you're going to find that what became the playing card deck grew from the original tarot decks and these other card systems, and that they would relate to different aspects in a person's psyche. And so when you got into the higher levels of the picture cards, they were all about the higher emotional centers. And so this explanation is given in The Manchurian Candidate, which is a fascinating movie, that the Queen of Diamonds is basically the ultimate key to unlock the psyche of Raymond Shaw, who is the assassin who's set up to kill the president. He's the Manchurian assassin for the Manchurian Candidate. And what they're trying to do is install this demagogue and assassinate the real president and have the demagogue, in the outrage of the fact that the real president got assassinated, get in there. Something very much like this took place when LBJ won by such a large margin after the Kennedy assassination. So the whole thing was highly predictive, and because there's a heavy, heavy mind control aspect in there, including some really hardcore factors, which hadn't been explored in film before at that point, the fact that they could program Raymond Shaw to do a killing and then not remember it. This is very innovative at the time. But what happens is Sinatra himself, not only does he take the lead role, but he ends up getting control of the movie itself. And what's interesting is he will make sure its release does not come out. It's supposed to come out just around the time of the Kennedy assassination. And instead, what happens is the Kennedy assassination happens and the movie doesn't come out, because it's so similar that there's an eerie quality to it. So some people in the research community around the 70s and 80s were of the opinion, as that movie was rumored that it was going to come back out. And of course it did. In the 80s, it was re-released, the full thing. And there's an interesting interview with Frank Sinatra where he's talking about this, and he says, yeah, I don't know how that didn't come out, and he looks all kind of dazed, and he's talking to Larry King, and he just looks like he's on another planet talking about it. So there's something weird about his actions in relation to the movie, the purchasing of the movie, and then suppressing the movie, keeping it down and out after the Kennedy assassination. Some of those researchers in the 70s and 80s suggested that Sinatra was using the movie as a wedge because he'd been booted out of the Kennedy circles, and that he was in his associations were having so many problems, including Giancana, that he was coming to Kennedy and being like, this is something to consider in relation to your own future, and that it was kind of a threat being directed. So I think those are interesting to revisit in light of the fact that there's so many unusual and heavy duty symbolism in the movie itself, and the fact that it deals with mind control, presidential assassination, which apparently is exactly what we got in November 22nd, 1963. But how does the UFO file and Judith Exner collide? That's the next piece that we're going to get to. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 192. This is Exner JFK Assassination UFO file mystery. We're going to take your questions here, let's say within the next 20 minutes or so. I have a lot more to lay on you in relation to this, but before I do, what do you got?
Colonello Valerio says, what about the movie The Parallax View with Warren Beatty?
parallax view is so intense and so accurate that you wonder, how did it even come out? But I suppose because the Church Committee, the Pike Commission, and even the Rockefeller Commission, which is more like a cleanup crew, but they were laying out these facts. The CIA had overstepped so dramatically that it was in the public. They needed a public cleanup for this. This is part of what the secret tapes about Nixon talking with the CIA director are all about. But this was happening, and the Church Committee in particular, I think, got dangerously close to what the Central Intelligence Agency had been involved in relation to the Kennedy assassination. The backup plan, I think one of the greatest tools that we have is the research of Professor Peter Dale Scott. And Peter Dale Scott said that the Kennedy assassination, if you look at it from an intelligence point of view, they had 3 phases to these stories. And the phases work something like this. The first story was, the president was assassinated, and the person who did it was a communist, and he did it for the Russians and the Cubans, and so therefore this is a great excuse to go after the Russians and the Cubans. That's story 1. The next story is, Oswald was a lone nut assassin, and so therefore none of the conspiracy stories are right. This is the perfect cover story that we can use because it'll prevent us from having a World War III with the Russians or bombing Cuba. And that's how they got people like, Earl Warren involved, who didn't want to have any involvement with this because I'm sure he understood the Central Intelligence Agency was deep, deep in the middle of it all. But they were able to use that as the excuse. There's going to be a war if you don't go along with this, if you don't shut up about Oswald and his connections. Well, the third story, which started to come out in the late 60s, was, the mafia was going to assassinate Castro, and somehow, as a result of that, the mafia assassinated President Kennedy, and we had to cover it up because it was the mafia. And that CIA, they made a mistake. They worked with the mafia, and it turned against President Kennedy. Poor innocent CIA. Those were the stories. That's the backup. Now, the mafia is the backup story, which they might even use with the declass going on now. This is the danger of the Central Intelligence Agency and the power that it's been able to maintain this narrative over decades. And, I've said this before, which is that the CIA was never really reformed because even though those 70s things happened, that's one period of time. But then you get back into the 80s, they're back in business. And when the Soviet Union falls, it seems like a victory for the Central Intelligence Agency. They get more emboldened, and then you get 9/11 and all of those things. So if anything, they're, and again, they get into trouble in relation to the torture programs. Remember Bloody Gina and all that in relation to the CIA activities and torturing prisoners in Iraq for information. Supposedly, the terrorism thing gives them the green light to do anything they want to do, right? One of those interrogation guys is Lou Elizondo, right? That's what he comes out of, and now they're selling that guy with the UFO threat. So you can see how these things kind of piggyback on the, when you get the same people involved, James Clapper and other people, and James Clapper's running the UFO threat aspect in the background. So to sum up on that, I think what we're seeing is the Central Intelligence Agency was never reformed. They grew and grew, and their power base has grown and expanded. So, they have their own Air Force. Their numbers have expanded. They interface dramatically with all of the other agencies. They build agencies like the NGA, Homeland Security, and all the rest of it. So they're entrenched throughout American society. And when it comes to the things that could defang the CIA, like the JFK records or whatever, they've always been able to, even under the most dire circumstances, like a president coming in and saying, I'm going to clear this whole thing and release the CIA records. There's always been a problem with doing that. And in this case, I think they have a real problem because Trump has sent in the people to do this. And so this is the real cleanup effort going on. The question is, how do they clean up their own act but still stay in business? And the mafia may be their go-to for that. Yeah, what do you got?
Well, there's a lot of questions about the CIA. So Bix Text wants to know who really runs the CIA. Scarmoge says Wall Street runs the CIA. Darcy Edmonds says, let's be blunt, the CIA equals the Galen organization. And Damin says, who is telling the Dulles brothers what to do?
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. At least this will give us the hint, which is the CIA is not actually, it doesn't come out of a military setup. It actually comes out of the S&C law firm. That's where Dulles was when he wrote the charter and all the rest. Now, he'd been involved, of course, in World War II and the OSS and everything else, but really, and you'll find this in the work of Professor Scott, if you investigate, The Devil's Chessboard is another one, really good book on this. But if you investigate where that comes from, it's definitely, the CIA is developed in Manhattan and DC as an interface with international finance. And then there's all these other elements that they take on. Somebody mentioned Galen there. There's a series of these things that come through that conduit. But the person who put it together, Harry Truman, didn't want it originally and thought of it as an American Gestapo. But then I think because of the UFO activity, he decided we're going to have to do it after the Roswell event. And what happens there is very interesting because he tries to install Midwest guys, people he can trust. And he tries to stay away from New York or DC types. But eventually what happens is Dulles gets in there from 53 to 61 and runs the whole thing. And it is Kennedy that fires him, which is a remarkable thing. I mean, it's like firing Hoover, but worse. So Kennedy was very, very brave to do this. And there are a number of things that are ramifications as a result of that. But Truman, after the Kennedy assassination, sees the fingerprints immediately of Central Intelligence Agency assassination and writes this incredible article 1 month to the day after the assassination, which is basically the CIA mended or ended. And he said, I didn't create it to be this Frankenstein, and it's cast a shadow over everything that we do. If it can't be, brought back into its patriotic purpose, then we have to do something about this because it's really, it's really overstepping the bounds of the Constitution. And it's a heavy, heavy duty piece of work. And of course, the CIA immediately, Dulles and others, try to get him to disavow it. And he said no. And they said, well, there are consequences for this. And Truman, according to aides, said, I'm old. You can't pull that stuff on me. And, do what you're going to do. And so Dulles, instead of doing anything to shorten Truman's life, he came back and gave an interview and said, well, he's not quite mentally with it anymore. He's got a little pinch of Alzheimer's. That's what's wrong with Truman. But these were the factors that were going on. Now, in the middle of all this, you have John Kennedy. And Kennedy's coming in on this wave. Now, remember this. Kennedy has been in office since 1946. He knows, as a congressman and as a senator, he knows where a lot of things are buried in this process. And although he's young to assume the presidency, he's got tremendous experience. He's been in World War II, and his dad has been the ambassador to the UK. He was over in the UK. He was able to study with the elite, the best of the UK, their diplomats and all the rest. So now a lot of people, when it comes to the UFO file research around JFK, they're like, well, there's so many factors that the traditional deep state researchers don't want to hear anything about the UFO file. They think it's some kind of disinformation piece or whatever. They can't hack it. That's a big problem because they have the best tools to disseminate how the UFO file is involved in the assassination. Because the UFO community doesn't have deep state people, it doesn't have deep state researchers in it. And they fail very often because they're looking for the next thing to run after. I remember putting certain things on the record about JFK and the UFO file. And, people like Douglas Caddy, who's the Watergate lawyer, who was great friends with Hunt and said Hunt told him that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. The UFO community wanted to run over the cliff with Lou Elizondo and the Tic Tac and all this CIA phony BS. So that's what you're up against. The UFO community does not have the intellectual heft, very rarely. And if they do have the intellectual heft, they have some bias against a particular political side or whatever that ruins it. So you find yourself in this situation quite a bit. What I've noticed is that if you could crisscross the deep understanding of the UFO file with the deep state research, you'd have a real formula for going after this thing and getting some answers. So Kennedy, when he's coming in, is encountering these aspects around the UFO file. Kennedy knows about the UFO file. This is what I've put on the record. Through Forrestal, close family friend who took him to Berlin after World War II. He writes a whole journalistic piece there. He doesn't even know if he's going into Congress yet. He thinks he's going to be a journalist. So, that aspect is shared with Kennedy through Forrestal, 1. 2, as part of naval intelligence, and it's part of the Congress, he gets information about the UFO file early on. And it builds over this period of time. Now, I've put this on the record over and over again for years. Then, certain people came out. Last summer, Malmgren came out, and he was a special advisor to President Kennedy in the White House, and he said the person who was doing the briefings on the UFO side was Bissell. So they were doing briefings on the UFO file for Kennedy. Now, and the other thing I want to say about Malmgren, he passed away, unfortunately, and we had some good conversations in the background about this, but publicly he stated on his Twitter X account these things. And so it's on the record there. Now, he didn't say, well, I saw spaceships and all the rest of it. He said, I was briefed on the UFO file. These were the high-level figures who were involved. And he also mentioned, a series of the Joint Chiefs and all the rest of it. So, the UFO file was a major factor in the Kennedy presidency. It was so secret that it's left out of so many of the official documents. And yet we have 2 major documents that do spell it out very specifically. And then there are a series of other reports in relation to it. And then you have the fact of the assassination itself and how the UFO file is involved. Now, it's interesting when people talk about Sam Giancana and they think, well, here's the mafioso thing, and Kennedy double-crossed the mafia and Giancana had him killed. Well, isn't it interesting, when I was going through one of the books, the double-cross book, Sam Giancana, who keeps popping up talking to Giancana, and who was from Chicago after all and headed the FBI office there? Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is giving all these reports back and forth with Sam Giancana in the book Double Cross. Guy Bannister, of course, discovered and was the early advocate inside the FBI for the UFO file. He's the one who named it the X-File, as we've reported in a number of documentaries, etc. So instantly you're going to find this crisscross. Now, going back to our figure that we're trying to open up in this process, Judith Campbell Exner and her relationship to JFK and how that relates to the UFO file, think about this for a moment. I'm going to read a quote of what she was looking at when she found the information that was being traded back and forth. this is her direct quote. This quote's in The Dark Side of Camelot. I'm also going to read from her Vanity Fair article, which I think is very, very informative. And then we'll do a couple more things, and then we'll go into your questions. Mm-hmm. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 192. Exner, Judith Campbell Exner, the JFK assassination, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, the 35th president, and the UFO file mystery revealed. Can this D-Class committee get their hands on something that's going to be worthwhile? This is worthwhile. And the FBI tracking of Exner is on record. And they try to get those records as far back as 1977. They never gave her those records. There's over 100 records. All right, here's what she had to say. She's talking about these various things going back and forth and how she was a courier. So first, I'll read this part and then what the contents were. Exner acknowledged that she did not at the time tell the truth to the church committee or at her news conference in 1975 about her service as a conduit between the president and the mob leader, Sam Giancana. Giancana had been brutally murdered in his home June 19th, 1975, the night before he was to meet with a lawyer for the church committee. They were going to haul him before the church committee to say, you know, what's the truth to these rumors about the CIA using you to assassinate different people? Furthermore, Exner told me the committee lawyers made it easy for her to shade the truth by asking the wrong questions during her deposition, whether she had been a conduit between Sam Giancana and the president. She was very narrowly answered no. They did not ask whether the document flow originated from Jack Kennedy. Her book, My Story, contained many distortions and inconsistencies, especially about her relationship with Giancana, but it also included impossible to refute details about her meetings with the Kennedys, including his private telephone numbers. After years of rumors about these liaisons, she was the first woman to come forward and admit to an affair with the president while he was at the White House. Kennedy's recklessness in the affair, once it became public knowledge, was a blow to his image and to the image of Camelot. And while the affair was taking place, it was also far more serious a relationship that exposed the president to blackmail the mob and friends of the mob. In August 1962, with the FBI watching, Judith Campbell Exner's apartment in Los Angeles was broken into by two brothers whose getaway car was rented for by their father, I.B. Hale, the chief of security for the General Dynamics Corporation, one of America's largest defense contractors. 3 months later, General Dynamics, everyone's second choice, was awarded a $6.5 billion contract for the experimental TFX jet fighters. This became the basis for setting up Pine Gap a couple of years later, America's Area 51 in Australia. Now, there's a lot there about I.B. Hale and all the rest of it. I want to point out the dates because they break into Exner's apartment 2 days before Marilyn Monroe is found dead. And if you look at where Exner was living, and then you look at Monroe's apartment, it's not that far away. It's within a half hour. So I.B. Hale has his two sons who are twins and have a very unusual, disposition. Like, they seem like born criminals to me. And I'll tell you what's weird about them in this whole soup of events is if you go back far enough, you're going to find when they're on the football team there at Beauregard High that they get into a fight with Lee Harvey Oswald. Mm-hmm. This is very, very strange. So some weird past stuff there, you could say. Look, the point is that somebody was breaking into her apartment and they were looking for something to use against her and against Kennedy. Something was going on there. And the FBI watched it. They didn't interfere. They let them break in. They watched them, and then they watched them take off. And they tracked who they were, and they knew it was the sons of I.B. Hale, General Dynamics Corporation. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, here's something else that she has to say. Now, it seems to me that Hirsch is looking and he's pushing to try to get these envelopes back and forth between Kennedy and Giancana to be money, payoffs and all the rest of it. And then what's happening is it's very interesting because in the middle of all this, Giancana is working with defense contractors. So now there's all these envelopes going back and forth through Exner to the president. She recalled these contract proposals for which she took payoffs into the White House. One envelope was for an unmanned vehicle on land, Exner said. It was one of the first of its kind, unmanned robotics. She remembered, she said, that the vehicle was massive, the size of a tank. The second project, she said, involved a new procedure for desalinization, an area that was being heavily researched by the government in the early 1960s. The final contract proposal dealt with the avionics for a fighter plane. Asked who initiated the process of sending this to the president, Exner told me it came from both sides. I know everybody was working together. I saw when there were transfers of cash, they were all in it. She personally delivered the money, Exner told me, along with the envelopes containing the technical data to Kennedy. So instead of Kennedy paying them off, they are sending these blueprints to Kennedy. And, there's this thing in there that somehow this is in relation to payoffs. Exner said she had never before discussed her role in bringing this to the president because she had no receipts or other evidence, and she was convinced no one would believe her account, just as few initially believed her testimony in 1975 about Kennedy's ties through her to Sam Giancana. But she did know, she said, that the FBI was aware of her relationship with Elwood and knew that he had invested money in one of his businesses. So there's a thing there about Dick Elwood and all the rest of it. I won't get into that part, but I want to snapshot two pieces here, which is what's going on doesn't seem to have anything to do with Castro or, the mafia shooting Castro. It's about experimental aircraft and other unmanned vehicles. And that somehow these blueprints are going back and forth, and Kennedy is getting these blueprints directly through this relationship and this activity of her as an intermediary and Sam Giancana. The question is, when you get to this level of hyper secrecy, what you're talking about is human intelligence or human. And President Kennedy was a master at using this human intelligence. I've described this process before where he would deliver his messages to Khrushchev completely outside of the State Department, completely outside of the CIA, by using individuals who were journalists and giving them his response in a magazine. They would go on a plane and land somewhere in Berlin, be taken off to East Berlin, and then go meet with Khrushchev, give him the envelope, get the exchange, get the other envelope, come back in. And he did this in so many different fashions. I believe this is something he must have learned from Joe Kennedy. And it's so brilliant because it doesn't leave any trail, and you are able to conduct a totally different type of diplomacy than you would be if you were under scrutiny. One of the things that really many people have said became the trigger for the Central Intelligence Agency to remove President Kennedy was his speech at American University. The speech that they got was totally that the State Department got was totally different from the speech he delivered, which was all about peace and how we need to look at the people in Russia the same way we look at ourselves, and we all breathe the same air and all that, everything that they didn't want to hear. And that speech is June 10th, 1963, and President Kennedy will be assassinated within a few months. So this is how he realized when he got in, he was going to have to work it. And I believe that there are other people who adopt this now. For example, I think when President Trump was being investigated, and they did the raid on Mar-a-Lago, I think that it was because he was using this human intelligence type network, and that they were looking for the key to what he had taken with him after he had left the presidency. It seemed like their own survival depended upon it. Did you notice that? And they went through the routine of saying, oh no, we do this to everybody. Look, we're going to do the same thing to Biden. And Biden, in fact, had real classified documents that he wasn't supposed to have because they were from his time as vice president. And what did they do with that? Well, it's very interesting because they said in their report, we're letting Biden off because he didn't know any better. And that was the way they whitewashed the whole thing. But what took place there when they raided Mar-a-Lago was very unusual. And that they took Melania's clothing and all the rest of it,
Like her panties.
Yes. And think about this. We're looking at, this is how these things work. One of the things that they supposedly were looking for was a napkin. So President Kennedy was utilizing a human intelligence network, and he was using this young actress as his intermediary, who was also his lover, as his intermediary with Sam Giancana. And Giancana was being approached by the CIA to assassinate Castro. I believe she was trading information back to Kennedy along this line, which was him getting information about what the CIA were offering Giancana and how they planned to do it outside of presidential protocol. But then the other part, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is here is Judith saying, when I opened the envelopes, I found these blueprints. And then here she is saying, by the way, some of these other things that I found, had to do with avionics and had to do with unmanned vehicles. What's this about? What does Sam Giancana have to do with that? And how does this all relate to the UFO file? That's where we're headed with this question and answer. It's Dark Journalist X Series 192. This is Judith Exner, Judith Campbell Exner, Irish Catholic who grew up under pretty good circumstances, you'd have to say, and was an aspiring actress before it all went wrong, and she became the target of the mob and became the target of the FBI and the CIA, and that made her a nervous wreck, and her life unraveled as a result. We're going to get to that and then to your questions. Everyone, before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I just want to say that she was a very classy woman.
Yeah.
And that, you would think mistress equals trampy.
Yeah.
But she's so composed and well-spoken and classy and
Yeah.
smart.
Yeah.
In interviews, she's an impressive woman.
Yeah. She talked about regrets over the fact that Kennedy was married. But what's interesting is she found herself caught up in this in her mid-20s and really, put into a position where the president now was giving her instructions for doing this for national security. And the big Hollywood moguls were bowing down to this Sam Flood character. And, there's another aspect there where once he learns that Kennedy can't see her anymore because the FBI has figured out their relationship, makes a big play for her and even tries to propose to her and all the rest. But I'm going to read a couple of her quotes. This is an FBI surveillance photo of Exner when she's transferring the packages for Kennedy to Giancana. And you're starting to see this kind of nervous tension, I think, going on. There was someone who said that he had been close to her as a rising starlet. He was a columnist. And he said, by 1962, I almost couldn't recognize her. So, it's very funny when you get into these situations, especially when you're a younger person and you get used. Look at some of the pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald, say the summer before the assassination or even in 1962. He looks like a different person. By the time you get to the guy in the Texas School Book Depository, he looks like he has dropped a tremendous amount of weight. He's lost more hair. He looks like a nervous wreck. He looks like he's about to unravel in front of everyone. This is what happens, the pressure cooker from the intelligence agencies, and they'll use who they will. Here's a little bit about what happened to Exner from her own quotes after it was revealed that, she gave the secret testimony in 1975. Then Giancana is killed before he can testify to the church committee, and she thinks, oh my God, I might be next. I became paralyzed with fear and started sleeping with a gun under my pillow, admitted Exner. Why did you speak out decades later? For the past 25 years, I've been terrified to tell the truth about my relationship with Jack Kennedy. In fact, I've gone to great lengths to keep the truth from ever coming out, which is probably the only reason I'm alive today. With the exception of Sinatra, all the key figures involved in my story have been murdered, she told People magazine. But devastatingly ill, she said that in 1988, but devastatingly ill with metastatic cancer, Exner, then 54, said, my doctor gives me about 3 years to live. In fact, she lived till 1999, and she died of breast cancer. I want to put my life in order so that I can die peacefully. For that reason, I must now tell the truth. Meanwhile, the mystery surrounding JFK's shocking assassination and whether the mob played a role in his death endures. Here's some more quotes. This is interesting. This is another columnist who knew her, and then after she dies, she writes this. After the shock of the JFK assassination, Judith isolated herself from almost everyone but people she knew from her old life. She was afraid she would be killed too. She had been told the FBI was keeping tabs on her, and the day after Marilyn Monroe died, she said her apartment had been burgled. The phone records were taken, but her jewels were left behind. Now, this is very interesting because we know the FBI watched her apartment, and they said 2 days before the Marilyn Monroe's death, these I.B. Hale's sons had gone into her apartment and ransacked it. So now here she is saying the day after Marilyn Monroe died, her apartment had been burgled. Somebody was looking for something. And my guess is they were looking for something in relation to these blueprints about these exotic craft.
I'm getting chills.
Yeah, isn't it? Oh my God. It really is. In 1976, after it was revealed that Judith Campbell had an affair with John F. Kennedy, Frank Sinatra issued a press statement about Judith Campbell Exner. Quote, hell hath no fury like a hustler with a literary agent. Ugh. He didn't want to be hauled in front of that committee to have to give up his mafia pals. And really, if you think about it, Sinatra's the one who got her involved in all this in the first place. And Sinatra, in my opinion, was under a heavy, heavy mind control to do this. I think that is something to say. In New York, March 7th, 1960, the Plaza Hotel, the eve of the New Hampshire primary, Senator Kennedy, who'd been introduced to Judith Campbell by Sinatra a month earlier in Las Vegas, arrives at hotel room 1651, and they begin to have an affair. A little more. In 1988, terribly ill, Judith Exner accepted money for telling People magazine she committed perjury when she testified before the church committee. Under oath and in fear for her life, she has denied being the link between the White House and the mafia, but in fact, she now confessed she was a go-between with Jack Kennedy and Sam Giancana, setting up meetings, carrying manila envelopes between the two. As a candidate, Kennedy had told her Sam could help me in the election, and the meetings and the courier service continued when Kennedy became president. And she says, I don't even feel today that I was making a mistake in taking these envelopes to Sam. If it was anybody's mistake, it was Jack's. And she, when she was trying to analyze Kennedy and all the rest of it, she had this observation about Kennedy Sr. and his bad impact on his sons. The father, Joe Kennedy Sr., really set the pace for the boys. I used to say that the Kennedy men were morally bankrupt. And I still feel that way. It's a rather harsh judgment, true, but that's what I came to realize about them. No one wants to accept it, but there is a very cold inner core to Jack, and everybody had to do what was right for Jack, whatever the consequences. So this is what she arrived at, in fact, after going through this process of being used as a courier and falling in love with the president and all the rest of it. But what's interesting is what Kennedy was doing there was he was deploying his human intelligence network, and he was, in fact, she had been the person who had been put on his radar by Sinatra. So they were doing their radar on Kennedy through her, and he was doing his observations of the Central Intelligence Agency and this advanced craft through her. So she was a major interface. And of course, as I mentioned, it was the actor William Campbell Trelane in Star Trek with unforgettable performance, of course. And he was the kind of bad first husband that she had. This setup of these three has often been looked at as, the big payoff for the mafia did it thing in the Kennedy assassination. What I found is when she's describing there with the blueprints, with the advanced craft, and with the back and forth, lends itself to the operation that Kennedy was doing somehow through Giancana, getting the information from defense contractors about advanced craft that he couldn't get through the Central Intelligence Agency. I've got more for you, but before we go any further, I'm going to throw it all over to you, Miss Olivia.
Okay.
And your questions.
All right. First of all, I'm going to start with this. From Thought says, I can't express how much I appreciate the hard work and deep research you do. Also, your method of presenting it. You leave no room for errors with the printouts. Quick and simple. I respect it. Okay. Next, David Termina. DJ Morley, Jefferson Morley, recently wrote that there's zero evidence for JFK being killed over the UFO issue. He also keeps responding to people on X about how Trump accused Ted Cruz's father of being involved. So I double-checked the Cruz story and found out Rafael Cruz was employed by Schlumberger,
Oh, yes.
who had a weapons bunker close to Bannister's office. And also, Cruz was in New Orleans when Oswald was there.
Yeah, and here's the thing. The Cruz story took off before Trump gave it any oxygen back when they were candidates vying for the presidency, the Republican nomination in 2016. So what Trump did is he just took advantage of the fact that this story was out there. So it's not a Trump story per se, but there's no question that Cruz was in the same locale as Oswald in the summer of 1963, and that a number of people identified the person who's handing out flyers with him as Cruz's dad. Now, that would be the kind of thing you'd want to hide. No question. It is no fault of Ted Cruz. But the fact that he worked for Schlumberger, I think, definitely tells us a lot. I mean, a lot of people did work for them at the time. But I feel like maybe, he's onto something. Morley, although he's a great journalist, he's one of these people like I've been describing. They are the deep state people who don't want anything to do with the UFO file. It's because they think they know everything because they've done the research on the deep state side. True. Now, I understand because of the clown show that the UFO file, the UFO field has become with Elizondo and CIA people coming in there, and the podcast mania with less than convincing people like the guy who loves the egg, News Nation and all that stuff. But I've been steadily tracking how they purposefully have been creating a UFO threat narrative and electing their people, like billionaire DOD official Chris Mellon has been controlling all the whistleblowers and all the rest of it. So they have a reason for turning the UFO field into this. The deep state people turning up their nose at the UFO research. I mean, you're going to research whatever you're interested in anyway. I'm just saying you miss a great deal if you are a deep state researcher and you don't, you don't take into account, for example, that the UFO file exists and has something deep involvement in the Kennedy assassination. Look, I'll just start with, and I go back to him over and over again, Douglas Caddy. He's a Watergate lawyer. In any other case of anything, if you're Jefferson Morley and you sit down to get information on Nixon or whatever, and somebody says, here's a Watergate lawyer and he said this about Nixon, you'd put it in your book. But because Douglas Caddy was a Watergate lawyer and he talked about UFOs, nobody would take that information and put it in the proper perspective on a historical basis. It is historic. He did it to me on this program multiple times. And it's a fact. I talked to St. John Hunt, who is E. Howard Hunt's son, and it's a fact that Hunt and Caddy were best friends. They worked together. He was his lawyer. So in private, he reveals to him John Kennedy was killed over the UFO file. That's big, big news. If you're a deep state person, if that was any other type of revelation, you would include it in your work. But because it's about the UFO file, you won't. That's where the deep state researchers miss the boat. And then the UFO people are so busy following the CIA people over a cliff with the tic tac and all that nonsense that they miss the real information that a deep state researcher, deep state researchers understand one thing. The government is good at disinformation. The government is excellent through counter intel agents like Elizondo and others that are out there on the front line swinging the bat for the UFO threat piece. And, Elizondo was just here, as I mentioned last week, and he came here on Monday, and there's a guy out there, alien scientist, who's in our chat sometimes. He went, and
did he get kicked out?
He did not. He asked a question, but what he said is very interesting. Is that the first half hour of the thing is all plagiarization. It's plagiarized from Carl Sagan, Close Encounters, whatever it happens to be, and this is them rolling out, Elizondo. And this is what the CIA people do, the counterintelligence people, is they plagiarize. And I've pointed that out with this show and the things that we've put out. And one of the things that I objected to, that one guy out there who was doing these interviews with Elizondo and people, Jesse Michaels, he was doing these interviews and they were saying, the Michaels guy does his own plagiarization of this show as it is. But then the weird thing was now the CIA people were talking like the points that we make on this show. And I'm like, oh, this is an interesting thing. They realize that they have a problem when people have been responding to the UFO threat part. It's even reaching the level of like the Joe Rogans and everything else where they're like, oh, maybe it's not good to talk to counterintelligence CIA people about the UFO file and expect the truth. Yeah, you think? Well, it's true. Well, now everybody's catching on. Good. So, this is the nature of the thing. So when I see them now reverting and saying, oh, UFOs are about psychic energy, what they're doing is they're taking the topic and they're like, let's talk about psionics for a while so we can try to legitimize Lou, because it's been outed that Mellon was running a UFO threat operation through people like Lou and Grush and others, and that David Grush told me that Chris Mellon was controlling him and what he could do. So he couldn't come on this program and talk to you and give you information about his experiences around the UFO file because Chris Mellon had told him not to. That's control. Billionaire DOD control for a UFO threat operation. There's no question about it. And that's the reason why Mellon freaked out online against me and said all these things, oh, he's a terrible journalist. And by the way, John Warner, he had John Warner on his show. They talked about me. Let me tell you, John Warner's dad liked me better. He liked me better than he liked his son. This is the mentality of the people that are running this operation. The stunted growth of people like Chris Mellon who have warped themselves because of the level of secrecy that they're involved in. They don't have the emotional empathy with humanity anymore. And that happens with a lot of intelligence people. That's the thing to watch out for. They get so good at lying that they live in lies. And one of the interesting things is, there was a guy who was in the CIA and got out and said the problem with the CIA is their motto, the thing that they go by, is that there is no truth. Truth is whatever is expedient for them to accomplish their goals. So that's a problem. Yeah, what do you got?
Okay, Joseph Farrell would like to know, DJ, which secret space conference was Bobby Inman at, and what do you think his interest was?
he came to the Secret Space Program Conference in Austin, which is actually in Bastrop, outside of Austin, that we set up in 2015. And I got, Joseph was there, gave a great presentation. Walter Bosley gave a great presentation. And what I was doing was I was trying to help the conference by getting Jim Mars and Linda Moulton Howe in there. And I think we had a very good card of speakers in relation to that. And there are now 3 different people who have told me Inman attended the conference. And, you know, it didn't surprise me, interestingly enough, of course, because this is the thing. The intelligence people keep an eye on the UFO community because they want to know what's going on. They want to know, you know, if any of their secrets are getting out. But in Inman's case, it's interesting, very, very interesting, because it strikes me he's part of an early disclosure effort, say circa 1988 to 1991. And the fact that he's the person who hands Joe Anides his Career Achievement Medal, and we know Joe Anides is the person who created the Oswald Project and did all the hiding of the JFK assassination records for years, that I think there's a tremendous amount we could learn from Inman. Now, he has not for many years tried to go on the record about UFOs or anything like that, but I would think this would be an opportunity for him. I mean, you know, you did bring it up once, and but I think a lot of his work has been about secrecy since then, including working for SAIC. So I doubt very highly he has any appetite for it. But yeah, he was there. He was certainly there. And I don't know which lectures he took in, but certainly he was there while we were there. Yes.
Okay, Ants wants to know, was the reason Kennedy never fired Hoover is that Hoover was a gatherer of intelligence on people for blackmail purposes and had damaging information on Kennedy, possibly sexual affairs?
Well, they certainly kept track of everything with Kennedy. I think what we have to understand is the long arm of Joseph Kennedy when the Kennedy administration is being set up, because he knows who to put in there. And he insists that Bobby Kennedy gets put in as Attorney General. He does that to neutralize Hoover, because technically Bobby is his boss. So if Hoover goes to move against the president, he's answerable to the Attorney General. This was what was so important. Do you remember early in the Trump presidency, the first time around, he had made the mistake of having Attorney General Sessions. And when these phony charges were brought against him in relation to the Russia, collusion hoax and all the rest of it, the Attorney General stepped aside and let Rosenthal prosecute Trump. So this is exactly the type of setup that Joseph Kennedy had walled off by having Robert Kennedy in there. The only problem was Robert Kennedy was only 35 years old and had never tried a case. He'd been on a lot of Senate committees and he was a brilliant lawyer, but he had never tried a case. So it was an unusual thing, and it's totally nepotism. However, in that case, we were incredibly fortunate, as Robert Kennedy was an outstanding Attorney General and an outstanding senator as well.
Ratboy Genius says, Joseph Kennedy must have had so much dirt on Hoover, there was an uneasy détente.
One of the things that Bobby Kennedy Jr. told me, and of course we did an interview that got banned very quickly, but in our conversation, he told me that the CIA attitude towards the Kennedys and their hostility toward them started long, long before the Kennedy assassination. So they had tracked Kennedy, and they had already been in opposition to him, but apparently they had also been in opposition to his dad, which I find interesting. When I went into a book that was about MI5 tracking and all the different people that they kept files on, I found that they have a treasure trove of documents on Joseph Kennedy in that they don't plan to release those documents for 100 years. So you could say, what kind of interference were they doing on Kennedy at that point? And, there's a lot of weird things that happen there, because when you're looking at President Kennedy, he only really got into politics because his brother, Joe Jr., died in a plane crash in a highly secretive mission. And the terrible tragedy of the Kennedys with plane crashes is just completely off the charts. But, and the fact that 3 out of the 4 sons die, and that the old man outlives them is pretty extraordinary. And also it's interesting because Ted, kind of lived his life as a senator with his head down, going, into pretty safe liberal territory. And he is not remembered the way that John or Robert, are in that sense. And I find that interesting, and not as a diss to Ted, who did his own things, but it's, and you could say, well, they were assassinated, that's why they were remembered. No, I think it's different. I think when you are a big risk taker, there's some resonance between you and the public because you're going to bat for them. And then I think in the case of Ted, he's not as well remembered because he wasn't really taking those big risks. I did have an interesting piece here. These are pictures of Sinatra with Marilyn. And of course, it looks like they used Marilyn as a kind of courier in her own way. But also they put her together with Giancana at a certain point in the running of Cal Neva, which was this incredible kind of casino resort. And interestingly, Cal Neva, Peter Dale Scott found, originally had Joe Kennedy as a partner. So here you go, back maybe into the 30s to find that. Then we go forward into the 50s. Cal Neva is there with Giancana and Sinatra. They're the owners. So, it's very interesting, but I think that Sinatra-Marilyn thing is very interesting as well, and shows Sinatra kind of developing these different people to interface with the mob characters. Of course, the cultivation, and you could say that Sinatra was kind of under orders to do this, but the cultivation of Kennedy as a senator going into the White House by the Rat Pack, Sinatra thing, and then putting him together with Judy Exner, is part of this process again. And I think, again, that this is something that Judy was not aware of till later in life. She started to put those figures and pieces together. One little sideline on her life is during this incredible sprawling period of time for her where she was under intense surveillance and doing all these drops for the president back and forth with Giancana, J. Edgar Hoover informs Bobby Kennedy and then has lunch with the president and says, we know all about your girlfriend, but she has a mafia boyfriend, so you can't see her anymore, but don't worry, we'll keep your secret. And it was a big warning, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program. And so Kennedy does eventually stop seeing Exner, and then she hears that he dies, and she's heartbroken for a year. And she, before that happens, though, in December of 1962, she goes to visit him at the White House, and she tells him that she's pregnant with his child. And he is like, pretty freaked out about it. But he says, whatever you need to do. And then what happens is she ends up having an abortion. But then after that, and then after Kennedy dies, she meets a Hollywood producer, has a relationship with him, but the Hollywood producer doesn't want anything to do with her. She gives the child up for adoption. At the end of her life, the child who had been looking for her, finds her. And that's her with her son, who she gave up for adoption in the 60s during the period of intense FBI surveillance and this incredible tightrope of working for President Kennedy to get these things back and forth between Giancana and defense contractors, he did find her.
It's such a sad life.
It is.
I mean, what's the point of being gorgeous and being,
Yeah.
raised, being well off and all this and having access to all of these famous, exciting people? And it's just her life is so...
It's courageous.
There's that.
and
But there's a lot of suffering in it.
Oh, there's no question. I was trying to make this point with you before we started the show, in fact, which is that President Kennedy, John Kennedy, was such a magnet. He had such a magnetizing effect on the world, and he was so magnetic in his own personality that he drew everything to him. So he drew wealth to him. He drew incredibly beautiful women. He drew all this stuff, but he also drew the politics of the world. And so he drew, the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was right there in the heart of all these things. There was something predestined about him and his personality. But what happens also when you are that magnetic is you draw in everything. So you're drawing in all these other elements. You draw in the mafia. You draw in your father's bad activities in the past, being a bootlegger. You draw in these different things, and so you're surrounded. You really have to sort that out. And it looks like one of the things that Judith Exner observed about Kennedy is that he was not being careful, and he was being reckless. And she was part of that reckless behavior cycle. But again, this is part of the incredible magnetism of him. Now, I want to say this. I've pointed this out before about the JFK files themselves. They are some of the most important treasure trove in the government, and the fact that the government tries to downplay them and say, well, we already gave you 97% of the records. Look, the 4,000 outstanding documents, each document can have up to 1,000 pages. So do you see the level of stuff? But all it takes is that one document referring to, for example, Joanides, and if we find his connection to the UFO file through this, those files dealing with Jim Garrison. There are other things as well, the William Manchester recordings, which are technically in the possession of the Kennedy Library. And I think the Kennedy Library has been pretty good about, what they've had access to, but there's a whole series of stealth archives involved in this. So the crux of it is the Kennedys had got into power and had figured out how that deep state operated, and they were trying to move the culture towards freedom. And so the deep state was their enemy and had to eliminate them. Then you have to ask, why would the deep state eliminate President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy? There are a number of factors, of course, involved in freedom around the world and how the world is going to go. I want to point out the UFO file because it's, as I've shown, it's been left out of the story, but it's a crucial part of the story, especially when you get into the aspect of President Kennedy being assassinated over the UFO file, and the fact that he was going to meet Lloyd Berkner, who was the UFO physicist, when he was, just as he's being assassinated, he's going to the Trade Mart to meet with Berkner. We did a whole documentary on it. What were they going to announce? Why did Berkner say in a letter afterwards, President Kennedy was going to make an announcement that was going to have international implications that were staggering? So those are the things that are on the record. There's no question. The Kennedy files, like I said, I don't expect them to say, the CIA assassinated President Kennedy, but the links are in there. And I'll tell you why. Because Robert Kennedy, 4 hours after the assassination, met with the CIA director, McCone, and he said, come to my farm in Virginia. We're going to have a very high-level meeting now. They had that meeting, and that's the farm. And that's the back of McCone. Robert Kennedy somehow as he had these abilities, somehow he put something in those records that's why they have sat on those records for 61 years and why they've been the ultimate trapdoor for the Central Intelligence Agency. There's something about the JFK records. It's not the mafia, and it's not a state actor. It's not Cuba or Russia or Israel or anything like that. There's something in those records that implicates the Central Intelligence Agency's efforts around the UFO file. This is the crux of the matter. That's what the D-Class Committee can get into. And if they do that, they'll blow things like the McClellan Committee out of the water, which the Kennedys took part in heavily and questioned people like Giancana, including saying to Giancana, "Oh, you'd like to giggle? Well, I thought only little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana." I mean, they're talking to the Godfather there. Pretty interesting. And at the same time, we learn that Kennedy says at a certain point to Judith Campbell Exner, "Don't worry with this FBI following you. They can't touch you. And by the way, Sam's with us. They can't do anything. You're not doing anything wrong. Sam's with us." Well, isn't that interesting? Yes.
Okay. So Quad 57 says, how did Sam Giancana get access to the UFO files? And Fuberfighter says, you could imagine that the relationship between the mob and the unions would have given them some operatives in the workforce who could spirit plans away from an aerospace plant.
Yes, bingo. And here's the thing. It's not so much that Giancana had access to the UFO file. It's that there's advanced aerospace involved in the entire Kennedy era. And by the way, we still have never found out what that advanced aerospace is. It's related directly to the UFO file, and the advanced technology that's associated gives you the context, the pretext for an assassination if that's going to be shared with the Russians. Isn't this what Kennedy was just about to do? Yes, that's on record. And he wanted all the, quote, high threat cases in relation to the UFO file to share with his Soviet counterparts. But more than that, he made the announcement in September at the UN speech that he wanted a joint moon mission. Then Sergei, who was Khrushchev's son, confirmed all of this later in life. He comes out in the 1990s. He's talking all about it. He said, yeah, they had decided behind the scenes, instead of having a race in space and, a space war, basically, that they were going to go into space together with joint missions to the moon, to Mars, and everything else. So if you have that, then the Cold War basically goes away. You can't realize any of those profits, and you have to share your most secret technology from the UFO file with your hated enemy if you are, for example, a paperclip German Nazi scientist who just killed 25 million Russians during World War II. So there is a logic to why these fractures exist. And I would say in relation to Kennedy, he was a bold thinker and he was going past what would be done traditionally. And if he thought, I can remove nuclear tensions in the world and prevent World War III by sharing the UFO file, that's what I'll do. And that's what he was setting his own government up to do. If you look at the memo that's at the JFK Library called Cooperation with Russia on Outer Space, that contains the framework for it and instructs NASA for what they're supposed to do. And then there are other memos to the CIA head at the time, McCone, to say, I want you to prepare these and have them ready to share with the Russians by February. That's in November. So obviously they never shared any of that stuff with the Russians. And this is part of the problem that we have now going back and forth, which is there's a system that wants to keep Russia and the United States hostile to each other because that system does what? That system prevents those two leaders from dealing with the UFO file directly. They have to go through the State Department, through the CIA, through the Kremlin and all of that. that has, you'll never get to any direct answers back and forth on the UFO file. But if those two guys sit down together, like Reagan and Gorbachev did, they're going to talk about the UFO file. Yes.
My chat just crashed.
Oh.
So I'm loading it back up again.
Oh, wow.
This is the second time that's happened.
Information overload. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight on the UFO file and Judith Exner, through the figure of Judith Exner and the extraordinary presidency of President Kennedy and all of the factors that were hanging out there in the background, including, organized crime at its ascendant. And yet organized crime grew and grew and grew and was integrated and integrated and integrated. Organized crime hasn't gone anywhere. There's drug dealing, prostitution, all these different things are at an all-time high. And, you'll sometimes hear in these different documentaries, like the mob got too arrogant and that's what ended it. No, they just got rid of a lot of middlemen. The mob never went away. They're incredibly active. Yes.
Okay. Atlantis Rising. Who were the top physicists/engineers with the aerospace technology of the time? Would Hal Puthoff and T.T. Brown have been in the know of this technology then?
Well, you can't put Hal Puthoff in the category of T.T. Brown because T.T. Brown is an ex-Share character. And, Puthoff is he's a CIA tool. And which, some people choose careers like that, and that's what they do. But he's not someone, because he's worked with the Elizondo, Mellon, and all that kind of thing. I don't consider him on that level. Thomas Townsend Brown was somebody who was a visionary who wanted to bring his science through, and the government used him on a number of black projects. But he also, as his daughter quoted from me, that when they wanted to turn one of his project into something else for the military-industrial complex, he would retreat, and he would retreat to the island of Eleuthera, interestingly enough, surrounded by machine gun security for a while. And ultimately, a lot of his work was gobbled up by the Rand Corporation. But there's a really weird story, which I can tell you, that she told me, which was that, the whole thing about the Adamski-style UFO craft, that she had seen her dad interact with a craft that had landed in their Virginia farm. And that from this encounter, that he carried something around that looked like a pretty large iPhone to me from her description. And that on his deathbed, when she was there, that Hal Puthoff was pressuring him to give him that or its location. And that when she went in after Puthoff was in there, and this is an extraordinary story that she tells, it's her own eyewitness account of her father. And this gives us a little insight into some of these characters, maybe, that he pointed to Puthoff through the glass in the hospital and said, don't ever talk to that guy. Don't ever give him any information. That's an evil person. So that's what T.T. Brown was thinking about Hal Puthoff. And when I saw the UFO threat erupt through the TTSA and Puthoff waving flags for it and all the rest of it, and the launch of Elizondo and Mellon and all that, then I understood what Brown was saying. So, Puthoff, look, he worked with Targ and launched remote viewing and all the rest of it, but the CIA gobbled that up. And you can see that Targ had the kind of ethics of what the program was about and how it could be used, to rescue diplomats and things like that. The psychic program, which it was. And he has an extraordinary background in it, but he has no hesitancy to say that the CIA killed Pat Price, who was their best remote viewer because he got into the UFO file. So you see the difference there. And he got away from CIA. Targ got away from CIA and realized what they were up to, whereas Puthoff built into that system And it's nothing personal to put off, but, when you get, like I say, investigative journalism is adversarial journalism by its nature. And so these are the things, these are the facts, and it can never be personal. So it's not a personal thing, but clearly when you line up with the CIA that deeply, it kind of answers itself in terms of the type of truth you're going to get to the public. Yes.
What did Pat Price trip into accidentally?
The UFO file. He figured out basically in his remote viewing sessions where we were keeping certain things. And that was a problem. But apparently what tipped the whole thing off, and it's a terrible shame, that they were surveilling him and that he was into Scientology. Mm-hmm. And Pat Price has a very unique story. He was actually a sheriff in a small California town, and he could look at the mug book for any crime that had just been committed and point to the person who had committed the crime and what their deal was. And he would help authorities find things that way. And they heard about him in that SRI program, and they brought him in. So Price was an unnatural psychic talent, and like an Ingo Swann type guy. And he helped with a number of incredible cases. But when he went in to talk to this Scientology person, he mentioned that my work now includes this UFO thing that I saw. And it's as a result, because they were keeping tabs on him and surveilling him, they heard him talk to his Scientology head and or the person who was running his clearing session or whatever. And because of that, they decided, no. And it's odd because on the record, Stansfield Turner, the very guy I started the program with, the CIA director, he made an unusual comment about the fact that the CIA, there were rumors that the CIA was keeping a psychic against his will. And he said, I'm sure that he's long since passed or something. So there's a weird thing there with CIA. Apparently the story goes that he was in a hotel, I believe in Las Vegas, and he was there for some conference, and he brushed up against somebody who just couldn't get around and was like, oh, sorry. And something very similar happened to Robert Sarbarker, who went on the record about the UFO file. These are ex-protect techniques. I've tried to point this group out. I think it needs to be a larger awareness in the UFO field generally. We understand about things like Men in Black and all the rest of it. And, a lot of the Men in Black stuff is projection. They're astral projections. They're not even technically there. But in relation to the X-Protect techniques, after they had done this, he went back up to his hotel room and he experienced this unusual thing, so that when he died and they found him, he was in some kind of strange position. So the drug had made him, whatever he was given, put him in some kind of weird, almost stigmata type pose. So very, very strange story. But
Would that be strychnine?
Interesting. Yeah. Excellent point. It could very well be. Mm-hmm. In the case of Sarbarker, it was jelly, a weird jelly on his car handle that did it. And he complained to his son. He's like, I'm in the hospital with chest pains. The weird thing is that there was this weird jelly I couldn't get off my the car when I was getting into it. So when you read about what they were trying to do with Castro and the weird things they were trying to do with his, mouthwash and all the rest of it, and the CIA they use toxic chemicals probably far more than bullets or anything as primitive as that. So this is why those types of groups need to be under, a real solid accountability umbrella, which they have not been. And President Kennedy's his whole presidency is in response to their out of control activity, because how can you really be any kind of democratic republic if you have a group making random decisions about which leader stays and which leader goes? It doesn't add up. This is the nature of the clash, and it's still the clash because we still don't have the records. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's X Series 192, Judith Exner. the JFK Assassination UFO file mystery. We're going to take a couple more of your questions, and I still have a few quotes to run by you. I wanted to show you this. President Kennedy had already encountered and faced death a couple of times, a deathly illness in his life. And I don't think that this gave him a sense of fate, the way that some people say, oh, he lost a sense of destiny or whatever. I think what it did was it made him very determined. And it's very interesting. On this trip with Jackie over to the Far East, he actually contracts something and they give him the last rites because they think he's going to die there. There was something extraordinary, and it's interesting because originally the father didn't spend a whole lot of time with Jack. He spent most of it on his older brother, Joe Jr., thinking he'll be the president. And he sort of thought of Jack as sickly and somebody who didn't have the focus. And he was a little bit harsher, apparently, with Jack as a result of that. But Jack had a kind of a sickly childhood, and I think it taught him what counted in life, as it were. And so I think when he went to stand on his principles, this is part of the experience in the background he was relying on. Yes.
Yeah, there's service there in the Kennedy bloodline.
Yes.
But there's also living like, this is not a dress rehearsal. It's what you got one go, live your life fully.
Well, it's interesting because remember when the drone stuff was happening in December over New Jersey? I was thinking to myself, this should be the ultimate wake-up call for everyone in relation to the UFO sky threat thing that they're trying to do through the COG people, because it was pretty well packaged. And once the siege was on, there was no way to get around it. Even people who were presidential candidates like Trump didn't seem to know what was going on. And so when you think about it, that was a huge wake-up call. The drone swarms that have been going on for the past 2 years really are a gigantic wake-up call about this sky event and how they can create out of whole cloth an emergency powers event and activate all sorts of martial law in relation to it. And of course, COG, continuity of government, is something we cover on this program extensively. But, I would say that there are times when we get much closer to it being activated. And I definitely feel that on the exit of the Biden administration was one of those, there was something that they were hanging out there being like, we can do this, we can make this happen. And you've seen it happen a few times with the continuity of government people. At the end of the Trump administration, the first time around, there was also this piece. So we have to be more aware that it is. And my great criticism is of the independent media around the drone thing is to make them be better. Because I can tell you this, almost like 99% of the entire field fell on its face when the drone thing was happening. They were buying the mainstream narrative that, oh, they're just misidentified planes. Don't think about it. Don't worry about it. No, they were swarms. That was a crisis. And somebody was doing it as a test inside of that structure. And there was maybe some kind of intimidation going on back and forth. So, if anything, the independent media needs to be something else. And I've been saying this, which is, the first version of the media, the corporate media, is one kind of paid media. But now so many of these forces have got into the independent media that you have kind of paid media one and paid podcast media too. So that's a problem. And I've pointed out that even the good people have gigantic staffs operating this stuff. And so it's different when you have independent people doing it versus this larger structure that's acting, astroturfing that it's independent. So you have to be pretty wise in all this. I think a third avenue of media is going to come out of this entire situation. And the third avenue of the media is going to be the dark journalism that we do on this program, because you're going to need it to, one, get past that corporate narrative, but then you're also going to need to, how do you sort through the kind of paid podcast? It's like, corporate media too, imitating and acting, playing the role of, co-opting the subjects and issues, and, openly grabbing some pretty bad bedfellows, including Peter Thiel, the Central Intelligence Agency. I don't know. I mean, you're going to need something else. And hopefully we're doing our best to lead the way with something that's potent. And the people that you see on this show, the incredible guests that we talk about on this program and who join us, those people are, their work is potent. There's no way around it. That's the wonderful thing about doing this for me, is I get to be in that milieu of people doing potent work. Yes.
Yeah, Fuber Fighter says someday we have to get our journalist to be interviewed by Tucker Carlson to set him straight on the basics of the UFO issue. Anytime I see the Tic Tac UFO gun cam video, my eyes roll back in my head.
I don't know. I think with a lot of these people who came out of Fox and went independent, of course, they're coming in with hundreds of millions of dollars. So is it really independent? But I think that they do good stuff. It's just whenever they get around the UFO file, they bow down to the CIA narrative, or they get carried away. News Nation does all kinds of real junk, like terrible, terrible reporting. And they own the Hill. They own other things. And so it might be by design, in a sense, that they include it in this sensationalist fashion. But I think that the whole thing could be much, much better. And, I think that people like Tucker or Megyn Kelly or whoever, they've tackled some good subjects over time. I'm just saying, on the UFO thing, they think that Lou Elizondo is, they're like, hey, we covered the UFO thing, Elizondo. No, that's the CIA counterintelligence narrative. So you need a totally different direction to get anywhere in terms of this. And I think it can be on a level that is completely non-government. You don't need any government people. You don't. I've studied the UFO file. I've talked to government people. We've had defense ministers on this program and some of the highest level people, but you don't need the government for the truth around the UFO file. You can get it as independent researchers if you work collectively, and if you have the UFO file being gone after the way that the deep state researchers go after political assassination, you can get to a much more potent place with the information. Otherwise, you're left with, a lot of intel manipulation, NGA, NRO, these groups coming in who are intel motivated. They're trained by the CIA. So you're not going to get the right type of information from them. I think where you have a congressional committee that wants to look into the UFO file, that you are able to unearth some things. Look, when I've studied committees, especially if you look at that period in the 70s, everyone thought the committees are going to get to the truth and we'll all live happily ever after. It's a window of time where those committees exist. Just like this committee, it'll only be there for a while. So we can get the best out of it, and if somebody like Luna and Burchett can do something, then I'm all for it. I'm not cynical in that sense. And I think maybe they're waking up to the fact that the whistleblowers that they've had have lied to them, and they've lied to them because they're on the government payroll, but they're pretending, just like Dan Farah and the Age of Disclosure documentary that came out at South by Southwest, and then all those people go and meet with Joe Rogan and do all that stuff. Look, that whole process, Dan Farah is Lou Elizondo's book agent. He's the director of that. When they question Elizondo, how can you get anything that's going to be legitimately impartial if the guy's his agent? And then he wants to promote all these other UFO whistleblower books. So he puts out a documentary called Age of Disclosure. And who
that features all of them, like weaves them in.
Oh yeah, no, it's 34 of them, and it's Mellon, Elizondo. Curiously missing Grush. I'm starting to wonder about that, but Grush is now a Hollywood consultant on the movie that Top Gun Maverick guys are doing, and I know with my own intel, I put this out on the record a few weeks ago, that Elizondo is at the core of the Spielberg movie in New Jersey. So it's all, you're getting all CIA junk on the UFO files, nothing to do with reality. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. X Series 192, the Judith Exner JFK Assassination UFO file mystery. Went deep with this. We still have some things to add on the record. But before we go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, all right, I want to go back to this. Nina says, has DJ considered that it may have been an advertising op for Trump's Iron Dome to protect the U.S.? That's the drones in Jersey.
Well, that's interesting. No, I don't think so. I think that Trump gets the Iron Dome thing directly from SDI Star Wars, and I think he wants it for the same reason, which is he wants it again to pull the UFO file back under executive control instead of where it is, which is apparently in some shadowy corridor of X-Protect between the intelligence community and a very dark corporate element. And so it's in that shadowy corridor. And so I think that Trump, like the Space Force, he has initiatives thinking outside the box of how do you get this thing back. And that's where I think you get the Star Wars Part 2, which is what really they should call this. They already have a funding proposal out there.
You don't think it's laying the groundwork for the public to accept something like that? Why it's necessary?
No, because it was under the Biden administration, and I think that the Biden people were using intimidation tactics on their own population. But I think that the group that was operating it has to do with this X-Protect group, and I think that they were collecting information for Northcom, and I think that Northcom was taking that information in and thinking, how would people respond to a sky threat? What would they do? What kind of panic would ensue? So that doesn't go to Trump. You know, Trump, Northcom doesn't like Trump. They have plans to remove Trump. So, you know, it's, yes, that it's an op, that it's testing the public. Yes, but it's coming from this Northcom COG X-Protect piece. It's not coming from Trump. Trump, like I said, is knowledgeable on the UFO file through Uncle John Trump, as we've demonstrated on this program. So he knows the value of it. The deep state might be on a higher level than he is in understanding what they can do with it and what they can't. But they don't like dealing with Trump because he is somebody who is on a par with them when it comes to these things. And they're used to having their presidents completely in the dark. So that's a problem for them. And I don't know if he can utilize it the way that he wants to here. But certainly the idea of a Star Wars 2 is, it's recognition that this UFO thing is in the air. Yeah.
Roger Z. DJ, can you explain for everyone what is COINTELPRO?
COINTELPRO is a program that came out of the FBI, and the idea was basically they were going to launch these various types of propaganda, and it was going to come through the FBI, and the COINTELPRO groups, it would spread out from there, so you would get all kinds of TV reports, newspaper people who were being positioned, and the FBI would give them particular types of instructions. So it was a propaganda effort, and I don't think that COINTELPRO went away. I think that it was very active. We know Hoover's COINTELPRO was very active in the 60s, and the idea was anyone who was going to be anti-war needed to be put on a list. And, we don't want anyone to be able to stop the military-industrial complex from getting going. And for me, those programs just, regrouped and became something else. even the COVID op was part of COINTELPRO, if you really think about it. But classically in history, I would say the 60s and the 70s are that period. And we learned a great deal about it through various committees and things that brought it to light, what the program was about. But I still, just like MK Ultra, I think that these programs, we only get the kind of cover sheet and the deeper things that they've done and that they're involved in. Totally different. What's interesting is when you see some of what we were pointing out earlier with Sinatra and Giancana and JFK and Judith Exner, do you see how just with one person, Judy, that they were able to get an eye view of President Kennedy, his deepest thoughts. They were able to, at the same time, have her used as a courier. And at the same time, they would have her relationship with Giancana and be able to track that. So you get one person, she's kind of an intel gold mine for those three things. Do you see how they work with it? And we can only expand that out when you start getting into people who are famous, like Sinatra and like Marilyn. And if you bring that forward into the 21st century, the levels that they're able to capture with this. So every type of different thing, from entertainment to media to the internet, they are captured on some level by this intel process. And so I think that some of these classic examples, really, the process has never really been undone. It's kind of an ongoing thing. It changes shapes and forms, and it provides not only a compelling story for the people who went through it. President Kennedy faced off against the deep state after all, and they assassinated him, but he was bravely confronting them. So he leaves an inspiring legacy. Robert Kennedy leaves an inspiring legacy because what they were trying to do, between not going to war and lessening tensions in the Cold War, not having a nuclear exchange, not weaponizing space, they're improving the culture of humanity. And that's a very, what I call X-share, move the culture forward and share that, versus the X-Protect group, which seems like they've had quite a heyday, especially since, 9/11. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We'll take a few more questions from you. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch through the incredible censorship that we're seeing, all the exciting things we have coming up for you. Live events, the new documentaries. Yes, there's a new JFK documentary in the works. And the fascinating one we have up there right now is JFK, The Final Speech, which is all about him going to meet with UFO physicist Lloyd Berkner, who had run the Robertson panel in the 50s, and that he was going to meet him on that day. And it's interesting. I think I have this picture. Let's see if we're lucky here. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Admiral Byrd, of course, and his incredible exploits in Antarctica, which the records are still sealed on after all these years. And after all, Operation High Jump is 1947. So you see, we live in a kind of twilight of what's been discovered. And that's part of the problem. And this is what I think Kennedy was trying to get everybody more on the same page. And one of the things that I found, here's one. This is a prototype. This is in 1947, right after the war. This is a prototype by the company that would become LTV, Ling Temco Vout, and who Byrd's cousin would be the owner of, but he would also own the Texas School Book Depository when the assassination took place. And many of you know that D.H. Byrd, we put on the record that he played a large role in all this, but he's also the cousin of the man who, really is the principal of our Antarctica. and through his expeditions. So we're looking at somebody in a combination of factors with Antarctica and the JFK assassination and advanced aerospace technology. That's the dot connecting that needs to happen when they're doing these committees. If you're going to do them in the 21st century, you better start connecting those dots. This thing was made before the Roswell incident, and that was made by the Ling Temco Vout company before they were LTV. So you can see, I mean, they're headed, that's their prototype. They're headed into this UFO tech back then. There's no question about it. Yes.
Okay, Sal A. Are aliens part of the deep state? Are aliens the actual overlords? And Fix It Fast says, one cannot make a logical conclusion about anything without knowledge of the alien influence. It ought to be apparent by now that evil ET were in control, but are now losing control. What say you, DJ?
Oh, well, I don't see, if evil ET were in charge, I don't see him losing any of that control. Do you? I don't. I think, actually, before I get into that, I found this picture. This is Lloyd Berkner burying a time capsule after President Kennedy's assassination. This time capsule would go missing, and there'd be this whole weird, where's the time capsule routine that I've got into at times. But like I'm saying, the impact of some of these things may be laying out somewhere in these stealth archives from the JFK assassination, a time capsule. Remember the whole story of Nixon's time capsule from Robert Merritt on this program. But what did Robert Merritt say he was? He was a courier. He transferred messages back and forth between Kissinger and Nixon. What did Judith Exner say she was? She was a courier. Who was she a courier for? JFK and Sam Giancana. What were they sending back and forth? Well, if you read the Mafia books, JFK-Mafia books, they all say, well, it was all obviously about assassinating Castro. Well, go a little bit deeper. Go a little bit deeper. What does she actually say? She was looking at blueprints. That's what they were trading back and forth, apparently. I wouldn't be surprised if there was money involved. But this is the aspect of the story that's been overlooked. No question about it. And of course, he's got high hopes. Jack has high hopes. And Sinatra had high hopes. But Kennedy figured out pretty quickly, this isn't going to happen. And apparently Sinatra turned on him there and started to promote Richard Nixon. Sinatra is a very, very interesting case in all this because he's manipulated to such a point by the mafia and the career they've given him that he is giving them entree, in some sense, to this political world that he can become the fixer for. So, at the same time, somebody like Sinatra may have had a very deep patriotism, but he's surrounded by these very, very interesting organized crime figures. So it's what he knows. So it's very interesting when you get into it. Also the fact that due to his early abuse, he may have been a very interesting, easy candidate for the kind of mind control techniques that were available. If you're operating on a place of getting intelligence about the president, the likelihood that mind control is being involved is high. And that's why I think the Manchurian Candidate movie is telling us a lot. And the fact that Sinatra is in it and gives a tremendous performance as Major Marco, but also the fact that he ends up buying the rights to the movie and controlling it, and then eventually releasing it in the 80s, tells us this movie was too hot to handle at the time. And remember, as soon as Kennedy's assassination happens, what happens immediately in the aftermath that involves Sinatra? Do you know? Do you remember? It's very interesting. his son gets kidnapped, and there's a whole ransom exchange, bizarro Lindbergh baby kind of situation. So something very strange there with our friend Frank Sinatra.
Do they cut a zero off or something like that?
No.
Okay. That's a different story.
Yeah, this was literally a scare for money.
Okay.
And it unraveled, but it sounded like a scary situation. And then you wonder, that happens right after the Kennedy assassination. It's quite unusual.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Najat Madri says, I wonder who today's Sinatra is.
There's a lot of candidates, I would say, for that. And we've seen people do, one of the things that happens, I think, is people do good research on entertainment figures. And we see a lot of that on the independent side, and it leads the way, usually. They open up things like the Diddy thing and all that. But the only thing that I think is missing, and that earlier researchers of the Mae Brussel type caliber had, is that she very often saw the celebrity as the casualty of the whole thing. So, for example, some of her investigations of John Belushi and other, major people who met with unusual ends, like drug overdoses and stuff, all the incredible musicians. She often was kind of the advocate on the celebrity side, saying that they were up against a machine or whatever. So you think about somebody like Britney Spears, for example. And these people are up against a machine. There's no question about it. That has them as a puppet that seeks to control them and, squeeze the life of the lemon out of them. And so for me, when I look at celebrities and I'm thinking about these types of things, I like to come in on her perspective more, which is that the celebrity is being used as opposed to what happens very often on the independent side is the celebrity is always the villain. I think a lot of the celebrities are used as puppets, and some of them are, brainless and thoughtless and deserve the kind of attention that they get. But there's a part of me that says that in entertainment, we should try more to open up the transparency of what the artist can talk about. And, especially when a great deal of money and messaging is concerned. Remember, they tried to have, Taylor Swift for Biden and all that nonsense.
Yeah, actually, that's Curtis Tarot is voting for Taylor Swift being today's Sinatra.
Well, that's interesting. I think, again, they know how to target them. Bono, somebody else said, yeah. Bono sold out so hard into the web.
This is interesting.
Oh, Oprah, yeah, certainly.
Voting.
But they couldn't sing like Old Blue Eyes, let's face it. Okay, let's take two more questions and we're out.
Was Exner just a straight-up honeypot, too polished, too much in the middle of the web, yet escapes? I think she was a CIA honeypot. And Bob Crandall says, is Judith Exner's son still alive, who was possibly told deeper details of her courier role and documents?
Well, I'll tell you something. I don't see it with the son, but I do know that before she passed away, like a decade before, that she had deposited out certain information that was related to all this stuff in case it were to come out. But she did that through family members, and she wasn't with, the son hadn't rediscovered her. He rediscovered her in the last year of her life, actually. The thing I wanted to do was have our friend Judith Exner tell you in her own words what happened. And so I have a couple of quick clips for you. We'll take your final question and we're out. Okay?
Okay, do you want to do your clip first?
Yes.
Okay.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 192, the Judith Exner JFK Assassination Mystery. I'm going to play you two recordings of Judith. They're both short, about 40 seconds. And this one is describing her mental state. 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 And this one is descri after dealing with all the surveillance. You know, somebody else was saying she was a honeypot. No, I think she was targeted out for this role and used to do these different things. But I think that they were, you know, just like they used Oswald, again, they put the person, you know, aside and they just used them as an intel tool. Here we go. Here is the first one.
Emotionally, I wasn't holding up very well. And I really almost had the feeling that decisions were being made as to whether I should live or die. For some reason, I sensed I was in terrible danger. And I don't know whether it was... I never felt danger from Sam, but I felt the situation maybe that I had found myself in, that I had put my life at risk.
So these are some recordings she made just before she passed away. And there she was saying it became clear to her after Kennedy was assassinated that she should fear for her own life. And once, it's interesting because she revisited the death of Mary Meyer, who was another person who was very close to President Kennedy and who died under mysterious circumstances in early 1964, and whose sister was, you know, married to the editor of the Washington Post and everything. There was a long list of mysterious deaths associated with the Kennedy assassination, and I think that Judith was lucky that she was not part of that. Here she is describing some of the surveillance.
After the meeting with Hoover, Jack called me, and he said, go to your mother's and call me. And then I called him back, and he said that he didn't think my phone was safe when I called him back from my mother's. And he said that he had just had this meeting with Hoover, and he called him an SOB, and he said he said he tried to use, you know, this information as leverage. You know, he said really his attitude was the gall of the man to try to intimidate him. He was livid. He was absolutely livid.
And there she is describing Hoover coming over for lunch with a file and saying, I know that you're dating this mafia girlfriend, but don't worry, I'll keep it a secret. But you have to end that relationship with her. And, you know, here's Kennedy saying, oh, you know, this little man with his file, and here I am, the president. But Kennedy was telling her, don't call me from your house, call me from your mother's house, knowing where the surveillance was. So I think we get some insights there into the type of life that she was leading. And I think it's only going to open up the deeper we go into Judith Exner. She's a major, major key, but crucially, the fact that what was transpiring there between Giancana and Kennedy with these envelopes may have been more on the nature of the advanced technology aerospace side, as she said the blueprints were, as opposed to straight up, you know, sort of mafia assassination kind of stuff with Castro and all that, which has been, you know, recycled and recycled. It's an explanation for everything, apparently. That doesn't make any sense, you know. And we can't boil it down to that. The CIA also, they have a great deal to lose, because if these files come out and they implicate the Central Intelligence Agency in any way, then their entire organization, everything that they are, you know, all the tentacles that they've built up over this period of time basically are in jeopardy over these 61-year-old files of them participating in the murder of President Kennedy. So you can see how high the stakes are. And so when they come in, you know, and keep delaying and pushing back that thing, I expect them to try to delay and push it back even more. But I feel like the records are going to come out, because Trump coming in has nothing that he owes to the Central Intelligence Agency. So there's no love lost there at all. He has his director, you know, and I think that he's done using the JFK records as a, you know, basically as a poker hand. I think that he is moving on from that position and thinks what he said is we can all learn from it. Well, we know before that he was saying to Napolitano, you couldn't release those records. You couldn't release them because of what's in there. Do you understand, Andrew Napolitano? Judge? He says, you couldn't. So that's what he was saying in 2020. Well, here he is saying we can all learn from it. So the 4 years have passed and he's decided, you know what? After the corruption that has gone on in the country over the last 4 years, it's not more secrecy. That's the answer. So he's got, you know, Trump is on that. And I think with certain people in the cabinet, like Bobby Kennedy Jr., like Tulsi, I mean, isn't it quite an unusual setup with this cabinet? We've never had a cabinet like this. So I think you might see major motion here back and forth, and you might see an attempt to throw out the whole story of the mafia being involved, or, you know, trying to come up with a Russian thing or whatever. But in those details, somewhere, somehow, in those JFK records, lies the key to the crime. And that's why the records have been so heavily censored for 60 years. Yes.
Okay, final question.
Yeah.
All right, Jessica Rodriguez. So, if you had to take a guess who killed JFK, I know the CIA and the FBI and the government were involved, but who done it or multiple people involved, best guess. And I'm going to add to that, who would you like to see prosecuted, held accountable, legally, personally? DJ.
Well, the people who were involved at the time are all dead.
Exactly.
But exposing the networks and the tentacles of those networks can change dramatically the nature of the future. And it will also correct so many of the lies. You know, people have lived and died with the false story of Lee Harvey Oswald and all the rest because the government refused, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, to accept it. And the reason that they did that was to protect the institution of the government. But the problem is it didn't. It created the scenario where even now 70% of the population doesn't believe the Oswald story. So they've been, you know, they've had a 60-year time bomb on the CIA side. And it's a total, I mean, it's a gigantic problem for them. It's a problem for them on PR. It's a problem for them on governance. It's a problem for them on trust. It's a problem for them on deep state activities. It's a problem for them on black budget activities. You know, there's a real possibility that you could get an entirely different intelligence service, not the CIA, out of this. And again, the CIA is extra constitutional in any case, and was created in an extra constitutional fashion, and isn't even what it was created for, as Harry Truman, the person who created it, notes in his own article on it. So there are a few things that we have in government now, Homeland Security. You know, they talk about, let's get rid of the Department of Education. Let's get rid of Homeland Security. 260,000 employees that weren't required before 9/11 suddenly are required. You telling me that with all the innovations and everything that we have, that you have an agency there that's almost 10 times the size of the Central Intelligence Agency? So what's going on is that whole thing is growing, the whole apparatus, as it were. And if you really want to make changes in government, the changes would be on the intelligence side, Homeland Security, and rolling back things, you know, like TSA, warrantless wiretapping. These are the things, the state of emergency that we've been under since September 11th. It's never been lifted. We're still under that state of emergency. That's why the threat of continuity of government is there. So you have the pathway and the possibility to have something totally different, before you get into the UFO threat that the CIA wants to launch. Do you see the value of the timing? So therefore, when you speak about the Kennedy assassination, it's a crux, it's a linchpin in history of deep state control. Professor Scott calls it the first deep state revolt against the presidency. Think of it that way. And there's been so many things said about it and all the rest. But the truth is, the aspect that has not been explored, except on this program and in a few other places, is the fact that Aerospace sits, the UFO file sits in the middle of the JFK assassination story. And it's been covered up because, you know, there's only been a few people who've gone on the record, but some of them, like Malmgren, you know, Caddy, these were people who were in a position to know. So when you put that together with the fact that we have people like Bannister involved, with Oswald, and that you have Oswald involved with Aerospace through NASA and Atsugi, you know, you have all kinds of things that are around Aerospace in the assassination, and there's no investigation of that aspect. If you open up that aspect, you're going to find a control piece that's beyond your wildest imagination, because of course, where does fundamental control come from? It comes from above on the ground. This is really what the original idea of a space station from the Nazis was, controlling things on the ground from above. And this is where everything was going to go, low Earth orbit satellites. Certainly all the control is coming down from there. That's why the SpaceX thing, you know, and you have that piece around the X technology with SpaceX and all the rest of it. So opening up the aerospace side of the JFK assassination would include the work with Joe Anides, and that you could get people like Inman, who's deeply involved with aerospace. It would include an investigation of Boeing, Lockheed, and General Dynamics, all of these things that were involved in that period of time. And if you opened it up to that, what you're going to find is this X-Protect group that exists inside the intelligence strata of the Central Intelligence Agency that deals with the UFO file are deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination. That's, you know, that's about as clear an answer as I can give you. There are levels to how it was operational, and there are things that are identified with the time period, like Vietnam, like the moon landing, and all these other pieces that are associated with it. But certainly it's the group, it's the intelligence group that is protecting the advanced technology that is the most threatened in that setup, far beyond a state actor or just the Fed, you know. And these things, when you see them at their most essential core, are they're interwoven, if you think about it. So the same group that's issuing the currency are the same group that want control from space. We don't have to think of them separately. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Wow.
I want to give a shout out. Really
Sure.
important. So Marta Allen says, prayers for my uncle Clay Wingo. He's a big fan here. Turned me on to your channel. He's in surgery right now at the VA in Kauai. Thank you. I have to say, this episode is the best to date.
Oh, fantastic.
So-
Well, I hope all of that goes incredibly well, and we're all with you on that. What an incredible group we've had here tonight. Great questions. Miss Olivia, bravo. Nicely done. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Oh, no, you're up.
I'm up. Okay.
Go for it.
I'd like to thank Eurythmia's Fun, Seattle Metaphysical Library, Tally Ho, Jay Parsons, Empire of Light, Jeremy, Thomas Ball, Ralph Smart, Tish M, Derek Gradaus. I'll do that right next time. Roosevelt Media News, C.A. Beverforden, Erica Swenson Elliott, Ray Story, Terry Doherty, Wolfgang McCarthy, Daniel Bain, Brian Whitaker, Tommy Van Gumpel, Marta Allen, Jake, Joe Werner, Debbie McAdoo, Amarillo Gunrunners. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, fantastic. And we really appreciate your support. Of course, to all our subscribers and supporters, thank you. We couldn't do the work that we do without you, and we very much appreciate it. We will be back with you next week, and we have some exciting things coming up. around the Kennedy assassination as well. That March 26th deadline is supposed to be the first kickoff for some of those files. But we have a great report for you next week with X-193, and we have great interviews coming up for you in April. Of course, that's that shot of Hoover and Kennedy, which picture says 1,000 words. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I'll do a couple of shout outs here as well. Those are great questions. It was great to have Dr. Farrell out there as well. Of course, he's been working very hard on these new books on Abraham Lincoln, which I'm just now getting my hands on. So we're going to have him back soon. And yeah, Jessica, Star Trek. Indeed. Jessica Rodriguez. Lois, Spiritual Science. Synergy Conscious. St. John Peniel. Interesting. Great name. DJ, hold history dearly. Indeed. Oh, it's so important. We've learned so much. And we have to say one thing, you know, Kennedy kind of took a bit of a bashing here tonight with all the different books and things. But I will say, you know, you have to remember about President Kennedy that he saved the world through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and by facing off and not taking the bait from the military-industrial complex, that he saw the world as a place of leveling the field so everyone could succeed. He wanted to have peace in space, and he took away our, desire for nuclear exchange and replaced it with the mantle of peace. So he really is an extraordinary figure, and I think it's interesting that Gorbachev said of him in 2012 that the world was still catching up to the vision of John F. Kennedy. Just an extraordinary leader and extraordinary person. And there's so many unusual things, of course, behind the scenes with him. But at core, this is somebody who believed in the world, believed in other people, and believed in everyone having a chance. And I think that came from his privileged upbringing. He wanted to be able to share that and create a culture that was educated and dynamic and, had a sense of destiny and being on the right side of what humanity could accomplish. So John F. Kennedy is an extraordinary, extraordinary president. And his policies, I think, and his goals, the moon mission and everything else, just show the boldness and the spirit of the man, just extraordinary. And that really sound leadership during crisis, like we just haven't seen.
I just want to add something. Kennedy believed in human potential.
Yes.
And that is something that we don't hear about a lot these days.
Yes, that's really true. Tim Houston, thanks, DJ and Olivia. Great show. Thank you, Tim. Tim was out there. He was waiting. Nicely done. Professor Hamamoto. It's great to see you out there. Ivan Langley. Astara. Indeed. Look at this generous donation from Lisa Davis. Thank you, Lisa. It helps us to put out the work that we do with the incredible support we get.
There's always new books coming in.
Oh my goodness, forget it. Happy St. Patty's Day. Indeed. Tip of the morning to you. Good information. Enjoyed it immensely. Thank you. That's old as dirt. Happy Herman. Oh, they're all out tonight. Who else you got? Corky Goss, David Murphy. Picture of J. Edgar and JFK. They both had that look.
Did you want to get a little tabloidy at the end and talk about what Kennedy's proclivities were all about?
I don't think so. But the deep state sex episode will happen at some point. Caritas Tarot. Thanks. Deep. I vote for DJ Boston meetups. Yes. Well, you might get an event coming up sooner than you think. So make sure you're on that newsletter list and you'll get all the information about it before anyone else. DJ for president. Jeez, can you imagine the whole president thing? My goodness, this would be incredible. What an incredible time to be president. And Let's see how Trump does here. Term 2, always interesting. And in between, missing a term. Let's see. Najat, it's great to see you out there. Good night. David Murphy, Action Faction, Golden Alley Cat. Caritas Tarot, we will overcome this. We're already on that path. Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Oh my God, you said my name in the chat. The ideas room is for dreams to come true. Don't ever forget that. And you guys, you give me all kinds of ideas and material. Lisa Davis, just stay away from the Canton PD. Ah, you must be referencing the Karen Reed trial. Very, very interesting indeed. DJ for UFO File Czar. There you
If
go.
you were UFO File Czar, what would you do as UFO File Czar?
Well, I do a very systematic search inside of certain organizations in the government. And also, you'd never have all that secrecy around the aerospace projects. DJ would be an amazing president. Thank you, Jessica. JFK's back pain sounds like it was dreadful. Yeah, part of that is the war. And part of that started, though, even before that. So he was in regular pain. He was familiar with pain. And he did a number of things to counter that. And, you know, it's interesting. I remember an interview with Ted Kennedy, who I got to meet when I was like 7 years old. But there was an interview with Ted Kennedy where he said, you know, my brother, because he was in such regular back pain, would take 3 hot showers every day. And it kind of, that helped him somehow. So this is something that he remembered. DJ is the journalist that JFK didn't get a chance to be. Wow. Well, I like that Why England Slept book. I think it shows a lot of kind of potential he had on the journalist side. It's interesting, his notes from Berlin, being over there after the war, where he's talking about how no one in the population believes that Hitler's dead. And he said the Russians certainly don't believe it. And then he's like, I don't think I believe it either. So yeah, watch out. Let's see. There was one up here. Camelot is at Paradise, California. I'll keep that in mind. Whew. Joseph Tugas, thank you, sir. It's great to see you out there. You would provide spiritual context, DJ, for the UFO phenomena plus the science. Yeah, we need both. If you go into the UFO thing without considering the psychic aspect or the intuitive field, this is why G.G. Young's work is so valuable, then, you know, you're going in with only half of your vision. I'll put it to you that way, because the entire thing requires and takes place on this other level. And that's where we get into some of that apotheum side of things.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Kontiki Man says, did they try some Castro stuff on JFK? It kind of begs the question, if they had other means of why shoot him the way that they did in that?
It's a demonstration. One, it's certainly a demonstration that they assassinated him during the day in broad daylight, during the, motorcade. But also, I think that they had decided on their different, kind of approaches for this, and that a military style ambush on a public street was actually something that would work. But they needed to get certain Secret Service people, let's say, working along with them, or else it wouldn't have worked.
Well, don't you think it was kind of a mass trauma event?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's a great way to put it. Mm-hmm. No question. And by design, no question. Caritas Tarot. Let's see. Well said. Got it. Jimmy Lyle Kemener. It's great to see you out there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Wow. Fantastic group tonight. Roger Z. I was looking for the final quote here. Let's see. Ghislaine Hitler. Kennedy was steel. I like that. That's what we'll end with. Indeed. And he stood up to the steel companies for raising their prices during wartime. That's the kind of guts that we need in the White House. And, maybe we'll get Camelot again. Everyone, it's been great being with you. And I hope I was able to share some of the life of Judith Campbell Exner, and who I think was an extraordinary person under extraordinary circumstances. And, who really lived quite a pressurized life after her involvement in this very, very high stakes tightrope activity with the President of the United States and the Godfather there. But she certainly lived a brave life and lived to tell about it. So what an extraordinary person she was. We will see you all next week. And it says end broadcast up there, but
never really ends.
Thank you, everyone. And have a fabulous weekend. Of course, we'll be back with you before you know it. And never let it be forgot, once there was a Camelot, and there could be again.
God bless everybody.